This is how Europe would look like in the 1920s, had Germany captured Paris in late 1914. So the Schlieffen Plan achieved its goal. This could happen had Russia not attacked Galicia and East Prussia, diverting German forces from the Western Front. But also, I want to touch on the gamble of invading the Netherlands as well. According to my community, 75% of you believe that France would surrender if Paris was captured in late 1914 or early 1915. Looking deeper, the people agree that France will not capitulate immediately after Paris is lost. The French government was already planning during the Great War to move its capital to Bordeaux and continue from there. It's fair to say that if Paris is lost, France will try to retake it, and only if they fail, they would eventually surrender. Let me show you what I came up with. Also, I'm starting a new series, so expect more episodes on this timeline. We all know how the Great War, also known as the First World War, went. An Austrian was shot in Bosnia by a Serbian, which is why Russia declared war on Germany, right? Makes sense. Germany had found itself on two fronts, so their goal was to knock France as quickly as possible out of the war, then focus on Russia and win the Great War. Instead of a quick victory on the Western Front, we got trench warfare, which meant that neither side could advance without losing hundreds of thousands of men. This could have all been prevented and Germany could have won the Great War had they captured Paris, which they almost did historically, as they were stopped 30 kilometers from the city. Artillery shots on the front lines could be heard in Paris, so the war was on the French capital's doorstep. The first option for Germany to capture Paris is to go through the Netherlands, which is a high risk and high reward situation. Germany had good relations with the Dutch and preferred to trade with them for the duration of the war. Attacking pretty much your only trading partner is not a smart move, but in the beginning of the war it wasn't known if it would be a war of attrition. Most people thought that this war would end by Christmas, so the mindset was not one of long war, hence why Germany invading the Netherlands is possible. Again, let me remind you that in retrospect, this would be a very bad idea. This path is not so realistic and it doesn't guarantee that Paris would fall, but let me briefly explore it. The advantage of attacking the Netherlands is that Germany can utilize their advanced railroads, so they can transport troops and equipment faster. Considering that their plan relied on speed, it was possible to capture Paris by attacking the Netherlands. On the other hand, of course, if the Netherlands resist more than expected, which is pretty much guaranteed, the Germans will get slowed down even more, which would make their situation even worse. I would say that this is a high risk and high reward scenario. Either Germany captures Paris or they die trying. Had Germany attacked the Netherlands and they were somehow successful against them, they could have won the Great War just 6 months after it had started. This is the most optimistic scenario, but the more likely option is that the Germans lose even faster. The Germans attacking the Netherlands deserve its own video, so I plan to make that a reality in the near future. Subscribe if you want to see that video. Another option for Germany to take Paris is if Austria-Hungary was slightly more competent, or Russia was extra incompetent for the war. The more likely option is for Germany to abandon East Prussia and hold out more defensible positions, which would cut in half their front line with the Russians, requiring fewer soldiers to hold. This means that more soldiers will remain in Western Europe, rather than for them to be transported to the Eastern Front. This is another high-risk, high-reward scenario, where it can go catastrophically for Germany, as Austria-Hungary could lose a lot of land and capitulate, or it can go perfectly for the Central Powers, allowing Germany to capture Paris with their extra soldiers. Either way, it's possible. Since this scenario is also very risky and according to the video's title, I will use the rewarding scenario in which Germany manages to capture Paris. There are countless opportunities for this to happen, and I already mentioned two of the most interesting and plausible ways for this to happen. Obviously, we have some more scenarios in which Belgium is somehow befriended, as they would be promised French lands in Europe and Africa, but this is too unlikely. Belgium was artificially made as a neutral country, prompted by Britain, so them caving to the Germans would cause a war earlier than the July crisis. Still, there are countless possibilities, but I want to choose the one where Germany and Austria-Hungary lose some land to Russia, and they do not send extra soldiers to fortify the region. Instead, Austria focuses on Serbia and Germany focuses on France and Belgium. This I think will make for a more entertaining scenario, but you can use any of the suggested alternatives I gave you for what you think is the most plausible way for Germany to capture Paris. So, the Germans would somehow capture Paris. What is next? Well, we can assume that the French government would have already moved to Bordeaux and continue the war from there, but retaking Paris would be their top priority. The French soldiers would lose a lot of morale from losing their capital, but the war would still drag on. Italy is more likely to remain neutral in this war, but I see Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire quickly joining the Central Powers. This would result in Serbia to capitulate a lot quicker, and the Eastern Front would stabilize. Other than that, the First World War is still ongoing and is looking almost exactly the same way. Since the French would try to retake Paris, this reminds me of the German plans in 1916. Historically, in 1916, due to trench warfare, the Germans planned to make the British and French attack them, wasting their men and resources. This could give the Germans the numerical supremacy, which they hoped would result in a breakthrough. I bet that Wilhelm II learned this strategy from playing Hearts of Iron IV. So, historically what happened is that Germany tried to take Verdun, starting the Battle of Verdun, lasting almost 10 months. The Germans hoped that if they take Verdun, since it was symbolic for France, the French would try to retake it at all costs, losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the process. This almost happened, but Germany never fully took Verdun, but the Battle of the Somme was initiated by France and Britain, with the goal to distract Germany and divert forces from Verdun. 1916 was a very bloody year on the Western Front, but why am I telling you all of this? Well, this is because Germany taking Paris in late 1914 or early 1915 would be very similar to these events I just mentioned. Just like how the French wanted to defend Verdun, they would defend Paris. It wasn't very likely for Germany to capture the city right away, so they would need to besiege it and maybe encircle it. The whole process of taking Paris would be 1 or 2 months, but I oversimplified it. So, when Germany inevitably takes Paris, which is according to the narrative of the video, we can expect France and Britain to do a similar offensive in scale of that of the Battle of the Somme. This exact battle was very large in scale, as for its duration of 4 months it involved more than 3 million soldiers on both sides. This would be the final attempt of France to win the war, their last chance. It is agreed that if France fails to retake Paris, they would have to sue for a separate peace deal. Now, you may say that it's more likely for France to retake Paris for whatever reason, but if this were to happen, then we would merge into the historical scenario, so nothing would really change. Even if what I'm about to say is unrealistic, it creates for a more interesting scenario. If you do believe that if Germany conquered Paris, then the French would simply retake it, then absolutely nothing would change in the grand scheme of the Great War. The peace treaty might be a little harsher on Germany, but that's about it. So, in this alternate timeline, the French would try their final counterattack, but they would fail. This is because the French army in 1914 and 1915 was still using bright blue uniforms, making it very easy for the German artillery to spot and destroy them. Additionally, the most industrialized region of France was the northeast, which is now almost all conquered by the Germans. Of course, the Mediterranean part of France is still very wealthy, but it cannot hope to carry the French to a potential victory. At that point, a war of attrition and trench warfare is likely to benefit the Germans. Wilhelm II has achieved his goal to get rid out of France as a potential enemy, so he can safely divert his forces to the Eastern Front. Seeing how the Central Powers are winning, it's possible for Italy to join the faction only to secure Nice, Savoy, Corsica and Tunisia. This is not too likely, as the Italians prefer to ally with the Entente and gain Austrian lands, but let me tell you my logic behind this decision. Italy can either sit this war out and gain nothing, or they can join the perceived by them winners at the last second and gain a bit of land for free, even if they have a lot of disagreements with them. I think it's smart for Italy to join this conflict on the side of the Central Powers at around mid-1915. Even if I'm wrong, it's not like the Italians are going to do anything. No matter which side they join, they either will sit on the Austrian Alps or they would sit on the French Alps, so nothing too much will change in the grand scheme of the war. Now, you may wonder why wouldn't Germany just conquer all of France, which is something that I don't think the Germans would do even if they were in this position. This is because if Germany were to pursue a strategy to conquer all of France before they go on the Eastern Front, this would for sure decimate the German war effort. Despite the Germans having more people than the French, as the French had around 40 million people, this means that if Germany had a strategy to conquer all of France, they would need to police, garrison and temporarily rule over 40 million people. This doesn't seem too appealing to me and probably to the German High Command if they were in this position. The more likely option is for Germany to take the northeast of France, which was the wealthiest, and cripple the French nation. As a result, France would be eliminated as a threat. At this point, France would either capitulate to Germany or more likely they would keep fighting. But in terms of strength, they would be equal to the Italians, so not a big challenge to Germany. I don't doubt that Britain would send soldiers and reinforcements, but considering that the wealthiest parts of France are conquered, the front lines would just stalemate. Speaking of France in 1915, let me show you these French coins that I have that were used during the Great War. This is 5 centimes from 1916, so this coin was used both during the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun. There are good odds that this exact coin was carried by a soldier, so there is a possibility that this coin took part in any of these battles. On the other hand, we have 10 centimes from 1917, and this coin was also used during the Great War. There is a lot of history behind both of these coins, and it's cool that I can touch something from a time period I'm talking about. Now, back to the video. So, the Germans greatly weakened France and now would move east, where Russia would be in danger. I think it's fair to say that there is no chance for the Russians, so the Bolshevik Revolution can come a year earlier. The provisional government by Kerensky, the Bolshevik Revolution and the subsequent Russian Civil War are very complicated topics, so for the sake of simplicity I will heavily oversimplify. The Germans would still send Lenin to St. Petersburg, also called Petrograd, and fund his communist cause, hoping for Russia to collapse due to instability. This becomes increasingly possible with bread prices increasing in Russia, and this time the Russians cannot look towards the west for help, so they would be entirely on their own. Unless Nicholas II signs a separate peace treaty with the Central Powers, there is going to be a Russian civil war, most likely being won by the Bolsheviks. For the sake of this video, I want to make something that would make it more interesting. First up, I don't think that Romania would get itself involved in this war, as they only joined in 1916 due to a successful Russian attack into Austria-Hungary. Such a successful Russian attack will never come in this alternate history, so the Romanian neutrality is more than likely guaranteed. Believe it or not, I will make Nicholas II sign a separate peace treaty, as he would lose the Baltics, Poland, Finland and parts of Ukraine. This humiliating peace would be needed and requested by the Russian population. Still, Nicholas II may lose power and we can have a similar event to the February Revolution, which put Alexander Kerensky as the provisional governor of Russia. While this would be claimed as temporarily, we would soon find out that his government would increase its grip in power and blame the Romanovs for Russia's defeat in the war. Going over for Germany, they were actually victorious in this war, which this time would last for about 2 years, instead of 4. This means that the United States of America and the Republic of China never entered the Entente. It's still possible for Portugal and Japan to join the Entente in 1915 or 1916. But the war was already won by Germany, so while it's cool to mention them, these countries will not do anything to change the course of the war. Now let me explore the peace treaty in which the Central Powers were victorious. Starting off with my home country of Bulgaria. They would get their claimed parts of Serbia, which is the whole of Macedonia and Niš province. Greece and Romania never joined this war, as I already mentioned the Romanian case, but the one of Greece is even more interesting. This is because the Greeks historically joined the Great War in the summer of 1917, so by this alternate history the war would already be over. This means that the Greeks took too long to choose a side and didn't participate in the war. Still, I expect Germany to grant them Cyprus and maybe southern Epirus from Albania if this is possible. This would be as a reward for their neutrality. This was apparently a proposal that the Germans made to Greece, as the Greeks would gain land in a case of a Central Powers victory. I expect them and Bulgaria to improve relations, with the Bulgarians stopping their claim on Thessaloniki and Greece stopping on their claim on Western Thrace. Relations between the two countries would normalize and improve thereafter. Speaking of Bulgaria, I think it's possible for them to regain southern Dobruja, if not the entirety of Dobruja. This is because Romania would be awarded what used to be Russian Bessarabia. This I think is a fair trade, with Bulgaria possibly taking slightly more, but I will let them have these gains for the sake of this video. To finish off with the Balkans, Serbia and Montenegro would be screwed, as they would become Austrian Crown states, with Austria taking the coastline of Montenegro, most notably the city of Kotor. As for the Eastern Front, we can expect Germany to dominate all these regions, with the brother of Wilhelm II actually becoming the king of Finland this time. Similar situation is that of Poland, which historically became a kingdom from 1917 to 1918, but a king was never elected. This time we can have another German nobleman become a king of Poland. Ukraine will also become a monarchy, with most likely a Habsburg sitting on the throne. Despite this, Germany would still have a lot of influence in the new nation. Since the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I would still die in 1916, we would have Charles I, the Austrian reformer king, come to power and be able to reform Austria-Hungary. Additionally, the country is not at war, so his reforms would be implemented right away, benefiting the region. The Caucasus are very possible to go to the Ottoman Empire, which is sad considering the Armenian situation. The Ottomans would surely get the British possessions in the Arabian Peninsula, but the Suez Canal is a stretch. The British are likely to keep fighting, but try to keep the Suez Canal, hence why it would not be awarded to the Ottoman Empire. As for Western Europe, the Germans will seize Nancy from France and annex Luxembourg. Belgium will be granted some French territory, and the country will cease to be a neutral nation, supported by Britain. Instead, it will be allied with the Germans, with another member of the Hohenzollern House ruling the country. France will lose Nice, Savoy, Corsica and Tunisia to Italy, which would satisfy the Italians greatly. British Malta and Gibraltar are also likely to go to Italy and Spain respectively. Overall, the Western Entente wouldn't lose any important European land, so they are more likely to agree to these peace terms. As for Africa, I see Germany reforming Middle Africa, connecting Cameroon to Namibia and Tanzania. Kenya and Uganda are also likely to become German, as this would allow for Germany to border Italy in Africa, which is Italian Somalia. Finally, in the peace deal, France, Britain and Russia will owe a lot of money to the Central Powers, and these countries will be blamed for starting the war. This would have several implications that I'll mention right now. This to you may look like the War of Kaiserreich in Hearts of Iron 4, but it's actually very different. The world is arguably more interesting than the one in Kaiserreich for several reasons. First up, since the war took only 2 years, there is unlikely to be an alternate economic collapse of Germany, which would mean no Great Depression. The second difference is that France and Britain are unlikely to go communist and for their respective governments to flee to Canada and the French colonies, as it was in Kaiserreich. We can expect the same governments of these countries to wage and initiate the Second World War this time. Another difference is that Italy is not broken up, but it's thriving and a united country, as they decided to join the Central Powers at the last moment after Paris had fallen, securing some easy land. Austria-Hungary can reform during the reign of Charles I, most likely becoming known as the United States of Europe. This is how the new European order would look like with the Central Powers emerging victorious, but it's soon about to change. For example, right after the Great War, Britain lost most of Ireland in our timeline, despite winning the war. This time, Britain had decisively lost the conflict, so we can assume that the Irish War of Independence would become an even bigger success. Despite this episode being part of a series, you can still watch it and see how the post-war society will develop. The exact borders are up for interpretation, as if Germany won in 1918, we would have different and more punishing borders, mostly in the east. For this scenario, I want to explore the post-war period, as Austria-Hungary is led by Charles I, the reformer king, who will start to reform the empire into the United States of Central Europe. Russia is also going to reform, just backwards, so let me show you how the world would shape before this alternate Second World War. I want to quickly mention that the Irish War of Independence, which was historically won by Ireland, started in 1919 and ended in 1921. There are two sides of the story, as historically, Britain was busy securing Ottoman lands in the Turkish War of Independence. Britain was also dealing with the Hungarian Soviet Republic, so you can say that the British army was very busy and spread throughout the world. This time, with Britain losing the war, there is no Turkish War of Independence and Hungarian Soviet Republic, meaning that the British soldiers would return home. As a result, it may be more likely for Britain to win the conflict against Ireland militarily, but I don't think the British would benefit from this move. Historically, in 1916, which is when the war would end according to part 1 of my scenario, the Irish people launched the Easter Rising against British rule, but the Irish were defeated after a week of fighting. People have said that the Easter Rising was one of the worst organized rebellions, hence why it cannot succeed, no matter if Britain has lost the Great War. I would take inspiration from this event, and for now, Britain will crush the first and initial Irish uprising, but this doesn't guarantee the British position on the island in the future. Ireland may revolt later, but for now, I think the most likely outcome is that the Irish are crushed. Still, life in Ireland is going to be tense, as the Irish wouldn't support the British, and now their country would be paying war reparations to Germany, as compensation for the Great War. This would impoverish the Irish, as perhaps they'll take the burden of paying most of the debt. In other words, the average Irishman is going to contribute and be taxed more than the average Englishman. This will have several implications later, as the hatred for the British Empire would continue to grow on the Irish island. As for the British politics, not a lot would change. The country would remain being a kingdom, led by George V, but the people are going to get radicalized through propaganda. They will seek revenge. Still, the British are broke and owe a lot of money to Germany, so such initiative will not come soon. As for British politics, at the time there were two major political parties, where in the 1910 elections, the Conservative and Liberal Unionists got 46.6% of the votes, and the opposition was the Liberals, and they got 44.2%. The rest were minor political parties, although I want to mention the Labour Party with 6.4% of the votes. I expect the Labour Party to get a lot more votes, maybe rising even to 15% at the expense mostly of the Conservative Party. This is significant as Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher were representatives of this party, with the Conservative Party losing their popularity as a result of Britain's defeat in the Great War. We may not see Winston Churchill's rise to power. The Conservative Party will lose popularity because they were pro-war even before Belgium was invaded, while the Liberals only wanted to join after Germany invaded Belgium. As a result, I think it's fair for the Conservative Party to take another hit and lose 10% of the votes, which would go to the Liberals, who would now get 54.2% and secure a majority. Britain is set to get radicalized in the future. They will have an election in 1918, so after 2 years in this scenario. The thing is that Britain didn't lose a lot of land in Europe, and they only lost a few colonies in Africa. The British are still not majority against Germany, and there are factions supporting neutrality in European wars. In fact, these factions are more popular than the ones who seek revenge. This is because Britain entered the war and lost land just because Serbia was invaded by Austria and because Belgium was invaded by Germany. None of these events had to do anything with Britain and their interests, so the British are going to drift more to neutrality and abandon France. As for the French, their politics are going to get insanely complicated. France was already a republic with free elections, but due to the loss of the Great War, some new parties would pop up. There is going to be a snap election in 1916, just 2 years after the one in 1914, where the Republican Union was victorious. Looking at the 1914 chart, no party got more than 19% of the votes. So to secure a 51% majority, the parties would need to work together in a coalition, including at least 3 major parties. Even then, France seemed to be very on the radical and left-leaning side. You can see this by their political parties' names, which are Republican Union, Republican Radical and Radical Socialist Party, French section of the Workers' International, Independent Radicals, Popular Liberal Action, Republican Left, Republican Socialist Party. You can see that about 28% of the people voted for left-leaning or radical parties. This is what historically happened in 1914, so if this time France were to lose the Great War, I think that the more likely option is for France to become socialist rather than ultranationalist. But only time will tell if I'm right. For the sake of simplicity, I will merge most of the political parties into one. We will have the Republican Front, which would have 51% of the votes, giving them a narrow majority. The left-leaning parties would also unite to form the Popular Front, and they would have 28% of the votes. The Independent Radicals will remain as an independent political party with 16% of the votes. As for the rest of the votes, there will be a new political party called French Revival, which would be far-right ultranationalist party, focused at restoring France as a global power, stopping the war reparations and seizing their former land, plus even more. This political party will get only 5% of the votes in 1916, but I expect them to grow as time goes on. Their goal would be to unite all the French speakers under one banner, including the French speakers of Switzerland, but also to form buffer states around France, making sure that Paris and France is never captured again. I want to briefly mention Germany, as not a lot would change in terms of their politics. Kaiser Wilhelm II would remain in charge and be even more popular. The German culture would be embraced as superior, as Germany won yet another war against France. In terms of economics, the war was expensive for the Germans, but not as much as you'd imagine. There is going to be a brief period of stagnation, but the war reparations from the former Entente would aid Germany's economy. I would say that the Germans would be centrist in terms of politics and be increasingly conservative. I don't think that the Germans would start liberalizing after they win the war, but I may be wrong. To briefly mention the United States of America, they are still the biggest economy in the world, but they are not interested in the European affairs. Additionally, the Americans never joined the Great War as it ended too quickly in the previous episode. The Americans are likely to remain neutral and isolationist, but want to be the hegemon of North and South America, preventing Germany and Britain from establishing influences in the region. In our timeline, the United States of America briefly occupied Haiti and the Dominican Republic for several reasons, which are not important for this scenario. What is important is that this brief occupation will become a little more permanent, as the American soldiers would start building military bases on the Hispaniola island. Going east, several countries were split off from Russia, this being Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states and Finland. Speaking of the Baltics, Russia, which is led by Alexander Kerensky, will try to reclaim them, as the Russians want to secure any victory possible. Life in Russia at the time would be especially brutal, as the bread prices would be increasing and inflation would be rampant. On top of that, Russia has to pay war reparations to the Central Powers, further impoverishing the Russian state and people. This is why Alexander Kerensky would want to invade the Baltics and at least secure a partial victory, as if he sits idle, most likely he would lose his position. Additionally, since the Russian army is no longer participating in the Great War, these soldiers can get radicalized and oppose Kerensky and his provisional government. Considering that the soldiers have military training and equipment, it's important for Kerensky's government to support the war veterans in any way possible, or they would turn against him. To keep these war veterans busy, Kerensky would send them to the front lines against the Baltic countries, with the goal either to win and secure a better peace deal, or to lose a lot of these soldiers and sign a white peace. Either way would work for Kerensky and his provisional government, as if 100,000 Russian soldiers die, these are 100,000 less soldiers that would take part in a coup against his government. Thus, Alexander Kerensky would create a win-win situation, so this war wouldn't really matter for him and his government. This is because the Russian regime would prefer to send future protesters to their death intentionally. Now you may argue that this is not too likely, but let me remind you that after the Great War ended, a lot more wars started. I already mentioned the Irish War of Independence, Turkish War of Independence and the Hungarian Soviet Republic, who sparked up several wars. But also Germany was in chaos. Bavaria was trying to become communist and declared war on Germany, but also on Switzerland. There was the Russian Civil War and then the Soviet-Polish War, and these are just the major conflicts in Europe. Now, going to our timeline, assuming that the post-war period would not have any conflicts and life is going to be peaceful is just plain foolish. There is going to be plenty of instability in the first couple of years after the Great War has ended in 1916. As for Russia, they would find themselves in an advantageous position, as the Baltic states were weaker. The Russian invasion would be initially successful, but obviously the Germans would inevitably show up and take the upper hand. Russia's gains would be massive, but remember that they are fighting countries with a couple million population each, and these countries had just become independent. The Russians are near the Estonian capital city of Revel, which would get later renamed to Tallinn, but also the Russian army would capture Daugava Pills. This is because the Russians would want to maximize the chaos and get as close as possible to Lithuania, attacking them as well. As I mentioned, Kerensky knew about the German involvement and this wasn't a surprise for him. He was very well aware of the suicidal mission for the Russian soldiers, but he wasn't intimidated by the German threat. Even worse, for thousands of Russian soldiers, their generals would order them to hold the fort city of Daugavpils when the Germans start arriving in numbers. Since Russia is starting to liberalize and open up, at least on paper, there's going to be partial freedom of the press. Soon, stories of the upcoming Russian defeat in the Baltics would reach the nation and antagonize the people. This is why Nicholas II and the Russian royal family most likely would be put under house arrest and be stripped out of their titles, with their property and assets being seized. Alexander Kerensky would hope that this news would make it to the headlines, rather than the defeat that the Russian Empire is going to suffer. As I already mentioned, the Russian army would be forced to hold the city of Daugavpils, which would result in Germany to encircle the city. While this would come as a surprise, Alexander Kerensky is happy to see less future protesters, but also the timing of dealing with the Romanovs is just perfect. The Russian royal family would be blamed for starting the Great War, and the Tsarist symbols would be removed from every building and currency possible. Such coins as this 1 ruble from 1824, which is exactly 200 years old in 2024, would be melted, and its silver would be used for war reparations, but also to make new coins out of this. Still, the Russian soldiers would be defeated at Daugavpils, and soon the provisional government would sue for white peace. there isn't going to be a lot of backlash from the population of Russia, as the provisional government would secure some sort of a deal where Ukrainian grain would be exported cheaply to the Russian people, alleviating their bread crisis. You can think of this as like the Winter War, where to us, the Soviet Union clearly lost, but the Soviet propaganda made it seem like the Soviet Union actually won. The Russian provisional government and Alexander Kerensky can therefore claim this as a Russian victory, as to them and their population they had just forced Germany to sell them cheap grain. This is far from the truth, but the Germans would prefer to end this conflict quickly just so they can consolidate power over the new states. In the previous episode I mentioned that Lenin would still be sent by the Germans to St. Petersburg, but you may be wondering where the communist revolution is. Well, Lenin historically arrived in Russia on the 16th of April 1917. In this timeline, the war was already over by then, but Lenin is still in the city or hiding in Finland. This is significant, as for now, Lenin and the Bolsheviks will not start a civil war. The reason why they were so successful historically is because they managed to leverage the ongoing war, promising peace and bread to everybody. Now the Bolsheviks cannot promise as much and secure a lot of support so quickly. Still, there are communists with revolutionary ideas in Russia, but for now they will not rise and start a civil war like they did historically. In my opinion, without a Great War still ongoing for Russia, I think it's very difficult or close to impossible for the communists to form a government and rule over Russia. Still, a civil war initiated by the Bolsheviks is possible, but not right away. For now, Russia is stabilizing and improving. This is the flag of the provisional government of Russia I came up with. The total population would be 134.2 million people, and Alexander Kerensky would be its temporary ruler. The GDP per capita would be $800, which is the same as 20 years prior in the start of the 1900s. This is almost half of what it used to be before the war. Finally, I bet that Moscow would become the new capital city, as St. Petersburg is close to the Finnish border, which is a German ally, but also because it was the capital of the Romanovs, which Kerensky would like to change. Going over to the Baltic states, these countries were just invaded by Russia, so them and Germany would realize that there should be a union between them. This country would become known as the United Baltic Duchies, with this cool flag that I made, and the ruler would become Adolf Pillar von Pilchow, who is a native Baltic German. The GDP per capita would be $1,100, which is quite good, equaling that of Sweden. As for their capital, it would most likely become Riga, due to its central location and strategic position. These countries would be united as to prevent Russia from striking them and picking them one by one. Also, Germany would want to have a unified Baltic state, which this time includes Lithuania. It's technically going to be a monarchy, but for now it would remain without a monarch, as there are several candidates. Some possibilities are Wilhelm Karl, who became known as Mindaugas II, who was the king of Lithuania historically in 1918. Another option is Prince Oscar of Prussia, who was the fifth son of Wilhelm II. It's going to take some time for the country to choose its monarch, but it's going to be one that is German and that the Germans would need to approve of him first. Going to another former Russian state, Ukraine became a kingdom and would fly this banner over their territory. Their king would be Archduke Wilhelm of Austria, who historically was a Ukrainian nationalist. He adopted the name Vasil Vyshivany and even died in Ukraine in 1948. He also was a poet, writing in Ukrainian, so I think he is a very fitting candidate to serve his country, despite him being a Habsburg. The GDP per capita of Ukraine would be rough, as it's going to be around $600, which is quite low. This is because during the Great War, Ukraine was the battleground, and scorcher tactics were applied by the Russians. Ukraine was also left underdeveloped on purpose by the Russian Empire before they lost the Great War. The Ukrainians control Kiev, but they are unlikely to make it their capital considering the proximity to Russia. I would say that Odessa is the most likely option. As for their population, despite their smaller size, they would bolster the impressive 14.9 million people. The Ukrainian state will claim not only modern-day borders of Ukraine, but also the areas where there is a Ukrainian majority. Now I'm aware that this will be controversial, as some would say that the Ukrainians are just confused Russians and that such ethnicity doesn't exist, but I will use this ethnic map, where it shows Ukrainians to inhabit Rostov and the surrounding areas. Poland is another country that would become a monarchy, but choosing its king would be a difficult one. This is because the father of Archduke Wilhelm of Austria, who is this time the ruler of Ukraine, historically claimed the throne of Poland during the country's existence in 1916-1918. I'm talking about Archduke Charles Stefan of Austria. Having a father and a son control such large swath of land I don't think would be desired by the Germans, as nothing would prevent the two from not staying loyal and breaking free. It would be cool to have a Polish-Ukrainian Union, but I don't think that it would be allowed by the Germans. Wilhelm II also didn't want to give the Polish crown to an Austrian, he wanted it for himself. So, historically, the only candidate that really had a shot at becoming the King of Poland during 1916-1918 was Kirill, Prince of Preslav, the second son of Ferdinand I. He was a Bulgarian, so while the idea of a Bulgarian ruling Poland sounds absurd, let me explain as it really makes sense. I will be basing my research on this document written about the event. It's in Bulgarian, but you can translate it for yourself. There it says that Kirill was also offered the Albanian throne in 1912, but him becoming the ruler of Poland really makes sense. Let me explain. This is because Kirill was a Catholic, not an Orthodox Christian, so the Catholic Poles would accept him, rather than a Protestant German. Also, the Germans and the Austrians have a history of carving up Poland. So if a candidate from these countries were to rule Poland, it would be seen by the people as these countries indirectly stealing Poland. Kirill was obviously also a fellow Slavic person, which is another plus for him and his cause to become the Polish king. Ferdinand I was also an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary during the Great War, and he historically mediated the Polish question. This is because Austria-Hungary wanted to annex the country, while the Germans wanted an independent kingdom with German influence. Ferdinand I offered Kirill as a compromise, and this time I suggest that this is implemented, as the Germans would win the war. In the document it is said that Germany, Austria-Hungary and Poland were fine with Kirill becoming the monarch, so considering this support, a Bulgarian would rise to the throne of Poland. If you think that there is some bias, I suggest that you read this document for yourself. Kirill would become known in Poland as Cyril I, with an interesting spelling of the word. Despite its reduced size, Poland will have 13.1 million people, 1.1 million fewer than the Ukrainians. Their capital is of course going to be Warsaw. The GDP per capita will be mixed, which is $700, but the west, closer to the German border, is going to be significantly wealthier than the east. There is also a big wealth inequality in terms of people living in the cities and the villages. Phew, that was a lot, but I want to tell you this information, as it's important for later in the series. Now I want to go back to the Balkans and go to Greece and Bulgaria specifically, who have stopped claiming each other's territory and are now working together. While to you this may seem strange, this I think is because the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire would be looking to dominate the Balkans. The only way for Greeks and Bulgarians to enjoy autonomy is to work together, or they would become somebody's vassal, like the Serbians did as a result of them losing the Great War. This Greco-Bulgar alliance is not one of friendship, but is one of necessity, as the circumstances call for it. Romania joining the alliance is also possible, but it's too unlikely, as the Romanians actively claim Transylvania, and Bulgaria and Greece are not looking to go to war just yet. They prefer to consolidate their new gains. Albania would get influenced by this new faction, which I would call the Salonika Pact, with this cool flag that I made. As a result, the Salonika Pact will include these three countries, with Romania being possible candidate in the future. This is strictly with the goal to prevent Austria or the Ottoman Empire to expand in the continent. Even Italy is possible to expand into the Balkans, as they claim Austrian lands but also Albania. Speaking of Italy, they will remain more or less the same ideologically, which is they would be led by the king. There is no way for the ultranationalists to rise to power. Italy would still be in an economic recession, as they had spent a lot of money on the Italo-Turkish War from 1911 to 1912, but now also on the Great War. This was a proper Italian recession, so for now the Italians would get radicalized and prefer to stay out of any future wars. There will be a political party called Italy First, calling for neutrality, and for Italy to consolidate their new gains rather than to risk losing them. Once the economic downturn is inevitably reversed, this political party would lose significance, but for now they would be the major party in Italy, demanding neutrality. The final major power I want to mention is the Ottoman Empire, who had expanded greatly in this war, mainly in the Arabian Peninsula and the Caucasus. The Ottoman Empire was liberal when it came to religion, so all the minorities could practice their religion different than Islam for extra tax. As for politics, I think that the Committee of Union and Progress, also known as the Young Turks, would lose popularity. This is because they were more liberal and leaning towards joining the Entente, so their popularity would tank after the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers and won the conflict. Historically, in 1913, there was a coup d'etat against the Grand Vizier Kamil Pasha, who was overthrown by the Young Turks. Kamil Pasha was hostile to the group and had been determined to destroy the political party. We can expect that with the Ottoman Empire winning the Great War that the Sultan would assume direct control over the country, which would be represented with this cool flag. The country would be guided by the Islamic faith, becoming a theocratic state. Traditional values would be embraced, and the Ottoman Empire would not industrialize as rapidly, like the rest of the Europeans, which would for sure pave the way for their collapse. I am yet to mention Austria. This is on purpose, as Charles I would have ambitions to reform the country, most notably adding a third crown under the empire for the Slavs in the Balkans. Will this secure Austria's place in Europe, or are they going to inevitably collapse, no matter these reforms? The thing is that Austria-Hungary was set to collapse. Looking at their minorities map, you can clearly see that many nationalities that did not speak the same language were bundled together, so their military was as a result less effective. Will by the end of this video Austria-Hungary reform, or will they collapse? Let me show you what I came up with. There were many problems in the multi-ethnic empire, but not just the Austro-Hungarian one, also the Ottoman Empire. I will mention both of these countries to reform in this video. In the case of Austria-Hungary, they were wealthy, which is why the country managed to keep it together for so long. I am aware that this wealth was not evenly distributed, as it was mainly located in Austria and parts of Hungary, so the Romanians and the South Slavs were considerably poorer. The fact is, and many historians agree to this, that Austria-Hungary was set to collapse, and I also support this idea. The state was too dysfunctional, and a way for them to survive is to perhaps give up a lot of territories to Italy, Poland and Ukraine. This will create an Austrian rump state, but at least the Habsburgs would still be in charge. This is one option, but I want to explore the more interesting scenario, where Austria-Hungary tries to keep most, if not all, of their territories. The initial plan of Karol I was to create a South Slavic crown, which would take land mainly from the Austrian portion of the empire, but notably from the Hungarian one as well. The Hungarians would be forced to cede their Croatian holdings, but still keep South Slavic lands in Vojvodina and West Banat. This can be beneficial to the Hungarians, as prior to that they didn't even have the majority in their own kingdom, making up around 47%. With Hungary giving up on some Slavic land, they can get the Hungarians within their kingdom to represent more than 50% of the population. This would temporarily satisfy the Hungarians, as this would enrich the ethnic Magyars at the expense of all the other minorities in the empire. So a third crown for the South Slavs would be formed, called Illyria. An important note is that Serbia and Montenegro are not allowed to join, at least not initially. This is because Austria just conquered them, and adding these hostile people to their empire with the rights of representation could mean that the whole of Illyria succeeds from the empire. Serbia and Montenegro would be merged into one state, called the Kingdom of Serbia-Montenegro, with Archduchess Elizabeth Marie of Austria becoming the country's monarch within a constitutional framework. This candidate could be considered controversial, as she was opposed to the regime of Vienna and later in her life became a socialist. Still, the Habsburgs would put her in charge of Serbia-Montenegro, with the hope of her not to get assassinated and win the hearts of the Serbian people. The constitution of Serbia-Montenegro would be entirely written by the Habsburgs in Vienna, limiting the power of the new queen. Austria-Hungary has reformed and thus will change its official name to the United Kingdom of Austria, Hungary and Illyria. You can see the deliberate wording, where Illyria is sort of pushed aside. This is because the South Slavs of the empire would not be equal, at least not initially, despite the goals of Charles I. It will take time for Illyria to properly integrate into the empire, with the eventual goal later to include Serbia-Montenegro. I want to mention Germany and their economic union of Middle Europa, which was a special customs union including all of these countries, so the Central Powers, their conquered lands, and some additional countries. This would be a special customs union, where no tax is owed on certain goods crossing the border. This can be seen as benefiting the Germans the most, as they would get cheap resources from elsewhere. Germany was rich in terms of natural resources, but they can get cheaper grain from the Baltics and Ukraine, in exchange for German steel, which the two countries lacked. Overall, most countries would benefit from this, especially the poorer countries with no natural resources. Of course, Germany will be the main beneficiary. I mention this because it would help Austria-Hungary and Illyria to stay afloat for the time being. If there is any sort of economic downturn, the Habsburg Empire can quickly cease to exist. But the way they do is more important than when. For now, Austria-Hungarian Illyria, which I will just call Austria for simplicity's sake, is stable, and we cannot expect many reforms to take place right away. The thing is that Karol I would choose to keep Galicia and not give it to Poland or Ukraine. This is because after the war, I see Germany and Austria falling out in favor, still being allies, but being more focused on consolidating their new gains. The Austrians would be upset of the outcome of the peace treaty, as the Austrian Empire didn't annex any territories directly. They just puppeted Serbia-Montenegro and put a Habsburg on the throne of Ukraine. Historically, Austria-Hungary wanted to annex Poland into their empire, which I'm sure will not create for more problems in the multi-ethnic empire. While this in retrospect we all know would be a bad idea, many in Austria felt betrayed by the Germans. Poland is technically not German, as it's ruled by Cyril I, the Bulgarian nobleman and son of Ferdinand I. The Germans do hold a lot of influence in Poland, so they are practically a German client state. The thing is that Austria would try to push Poland into their sphere of influence. This is because the Poles prefer the Catholic Austrians over the Protestant Germans. Austria would also be willing to grant Poland all or most of Galicia in exchange for Poland joining the Habsburg Monarchy, maybe as another crown. This, I want to remind you, is just a proposal, but I believe that this is more likely than for Germany to give up their ethnically Polish lands and secure Poland as an ally. This is why, despite the tensions and the problems in the Habsburg monarchy, the country would try to make Poland join their side, which would sour relations with the Germans. Austria annexing Poland is still very far from this scenario, but the Austrian effort would go towards improving relations with Poland and Cyril I. This is pretty much the state of Central Europe, as Austria is reforming, but the Hungarians are not happy. Later, the Hungarians would demand compensation for their losses in Croatia. The only way in Hungary can realistically expand to is in Romania, as the country is not allied with any major power and is isolated by the Habsburgs and the Bulgarians. As a result, the Hungarian portion of the empire will push for an eventual war with Romania, making Hungary expand into Wallachia and Moldavia, puppeting these two states. This of course would be refused by the Austrian portion, calling it insane. As a result, Hungary would demand monetary compensation from Austria for creation of the Illyrian crown. The Austrians would be faced with a difficult choice, as now they can either refuse, which would further antagonize the Hungarian portion, or they can agree to pay, which would make the post-war economy of the state on the brink of collapse. I see a conference being held, where Austria will agree to a Hungarian compromise with land or money in the near future. But as to prevent an economic collapse, the Austrians will ask the Hungarians to wait for a few years, to which the Hungarians would agree. This would give Austria some time to think of a solution. An idea would surface where Hungary can be paid not from the Austrian coffer, but the one from Illyria. Mind you, the Slavic portion of the empire in the Balkans was at the time among the poorest, so them paying the Hungarians would further impoverish the South Slavs. This would be a big gamble for Austria, as either they pay the Hungarians from their own coffer and suffer economic hardships, most likely resulting in the empire to get partitioned. The other option is that Illyria is forced to pay Hungary for taking their Croatian holdings, but then we would see another problem. Since the Illyrians would become even poorer, the people may get radicalized and ideas of leaving the Union would become increasingly popular. It looks like Austria is in a position where they are destined to lose either Hungary or Illyria, but trying to keep both would make sure that the empire collapses. This would be a problem to deal with after a few years, so Karol I can think of another reform to keep his empire afloat, or to minimize the collapse of it. Time will tell if only these reforms would succeed or not. I want to briefly show you a banknote I have from Hungary, and the year is 1849. Interestingly enough, when the Hungarian Revolution of 1848 was crushed and the Austrians military occupied Hungary. I'm showing you this banknote as on the back you can see that it has the same text in Hungarian, Austrian, and I think Serbian, Slovak, but also on the bottom it may be Romanian, as the Romanians used to write in Cyrillic script back in the day. Now, back to the video. In the previous episode, I mentioned that the Ottoman Empire would become increasingly Islamist, which you may say will not change a lot, but I want to point a key detail that you're missing. It is that historically, and most likely in this timeline as well, the Ottoman Empire declared jihad on most of the Entente. This is important as the Ottoman Empire holds the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, but is also the only Islamic major power. At the time, there would be only two other independent Islamic countries in the world, which are Persia and Afghanistan. The thing is that France and Britain and even Russia hold a lot of Muslim lands in their colonies. While the Ottoman Empire will return to traditionalism and refuse to modernize, they can still pose a threat to the world. Most likely after the Ottoman Empire consolidates their power, they can call for a jihad against the French, British and Russians. The goal would be to liberate Central Asia from Russia's grip, to liberate Pakistan and maybe even Bangladesh, and then to liberate Algeria and Morocco from France. You will notice that the Ottoman Empire will not focus on Europe, so their foreign policy is regarding liberating and uniting the Muslim people. As a result, the Ottomans would be disconnected from European affairs, but also their government would be a lot weaker. This would result in Germany and Britain to step in and try to fill the gaps, influencing the nation greatly. For now, this would not be significant, but in the future it would be catastrophic for the Ottoman Empire. Since the Ottoman Empire annexed the Caucasus, they can create a Georgian vilayet while annexing Armenia and Azerbaijan directly. Finally, the Ottoman Empire would create the Baghdad Pact with Persia and Afghanistan, who would join the alliance due to their shared Islamic faith and desire to liberate the Muslims from the Europeans. It hurts me to say it, but the Ottoman Empire would start a process of ethnic cleansing, so making sure that there is no minority of non-Turkish or non-Arabic people in any region. This would be especially brutal for the Christian Armenians and Greeks, who would be the first target of the Ottoman Empire. Greece is this time allied with Bulgaria and Albania, so the faction may be willing to declare war on the Ottoman Empire if mainly Greeks, but also Bulgarian minorities, get hurt once again by the Ottoman Sultanate. The thing is that Albania was majority Muslim, so they are unlikely to join this invasion and may be even willing to betray their allies. While this will not change a lot, it's a fact worth mentioning. Another fact worth mentioning is the Russians, who can also join in a possible partition of the Ottoman Empire, in case a third Balkan War, where Bulgaria and Greece decide to strike the Ottomans for the final time and seize Constantinople. The Russians are led by the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky, which is looking more and more like a permanent government, or as I would like to call it, eternal provisional government, aka dictatorship. The Russians are going to cooperate with the Salonika Pact, as if they defeat the Ottoman Empire and gain their claimed lands, the Russians can celebrate this as their first victory. It can be interpreted as Russia being on the path of restoring the borders of their former empire. Still, the Russians were just defeated in the Baltics, resulting in these countries to unify. The army and economy of Russia are not ready for such a war, but keep your eyes on it. If Russia improves relations with the Salonika Pact, where Greece and Bulgaria are both Orthodox Christians, the same fate as the Russians, this can create a mega faction. The thing is that the Salonika Pact was formed to protect the Balkans from foreign influence. If the Russians join it, they will dominate the pact, so it would go against the pact's very reason for existing. Bulgaria and Greece are also not interested in helping Russia out to restore their former lands by going to war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, so any major cooperation between Russia and the Salonika Pact is not guaranteed to happen. They might briefly cooperate with the partition of the Ottoman Empire, but this would be about it. While an orthodox mega faction sounds very interesting, it cannot work due to the goals of each country. The thing is that there is growing German and British influence in the Ottoman Empire, so these countries would need to strike fast before either Germany or Britain consolidates power and decide to join the Ottoman side in case of a potential invasion. Going over to France, the country will see pro-French revival demonstrations, which, let me remind you, is the ultranationalist faction seeking revenge in France. The political party got only 5% of the votes, but due to the snap elections in 1916, there would be another election in 1918. This must happen, as France just lost the war, so the French revival couldn't form a party and secure more support in the snap elections. As a result, we can expect their support to increase in the 1918 elections. The results of this ultranationalist rally in France would show the people that more than 5% of the population are in favor of seeking revenge and reclaiming the former glory of France, if not taking all French-speaking lands, and some crazier factions are calling for France to be expanded to naturally defendable positions, making sure that France and Paris is never captured. Algeria would respond to these rallies with a minor pro-independence Islamic rebellion, inspired and maybe sponsored by the Ottoman Empire. The Algerian rebels do not wish to be part of France dominated by the French revival or the socialists. It has been believed that any of these parties will seek revenge and make France to participate in another war with Germany, so the Islamic Algerians would suffer greatly. You may be quick to suggest that this rebellion is no big deal, and you would be right. These freedom fighters would be poorly armed and be no match for the French professional army. The thing is that France would have a limited army, not due to army restrictions by the Germans, but because they would be lacking guns. While this may seem strange, the French military factories would be closed because of lack of resources. What happened is that Germany took some small parts of France, but little did you know that 80 to 90% of France's iron and a solid amount of their coal comes from this exact region. The minor Algerian rebellion would show to the world how weak France is immediately after the war, which would have several implications in the next scenario, where France will continue their insurgency with Algeria, but also Morocco would rebel. This is due to the Ottoman Empire, which would declare jihad and call for all Muslims to rise against their colonial oppressors. This would hit Britain especially hard, as the British would risk losing Pakistan and by extension India, but also Egypt and the Suez Canal. If this were to happen, most British possessions like Ireland and South Africa may choose to abandon the crown, which I think is really likely in this scenario. The British found themselves on the losing side of the war, and although the Irish Rebellion, called the Easter Rising in 1916, was crushed by the British, it inspired anti-British sentiment around the world. This failed Irish Rebellion becomes a symbol for freedom fighters against the British around the world, with the clover leaf becoming a symbol against British imperialism. In the previous episode, France was having trouble with Algerian rebels. Tensions would quickly spill to the British Empire as well. While the French would quickly defeat the Algerian rebels, anti-British sentiments would grow around the world. This was especially seen in South Africa, which historically sympathized with the Central Powers in 1916. Now, considering that the faction was victorious, South Africa can pursue close relations with Germany in the continent, so the two countries would border each other. South Africa is also further in a beneficial position as they can get the British possessions, which are modern-day Lesotho, Eswatini, Botswana and Zimbabwe. Additionally, Britain historically experienced large-scale rebellions during the Irish War of Independence, so this time if there is a war between South Africa and Great Britain, I would put my money on South Africa. This is because the British cannot hope to conquer the country, and even if they have several successful landings, eventually the British citizens would demand peace and economic prosperity. As a result, even if Britain is extra competent against South Africa, the South Africans can simply retreat into their core territory, which is 5 times bigger than mainland Britain by the way, and fight in a war of attrition. The odds are stacked against the British in case there is a war, but this can also be resolved diplomatically. South Africa wasn't just a colony, but they were practically a dominion, although in 1916 they didn't have this status. The country acted as an independent nation, so them becoming a republic and abandoning George V as head of state is possible. In any case, if there is war or not, the province of Natal, which was the most pro-British, is likely to remain under the crown, but the rest would fall to South Africa. Swaziland and Lesotho would border the province of Natal, so them remaining as part of the British Commonwealth is possible, and I will allow it for this scenario. South Africa just became independent with a pro-German government, either diplomatically or with a brief war. Any alternative is possible. This is a flag that I made and I think that it will be used by this alternate South Africa, and since the province of Natal is gone from their coastal farms, it will be replaced with a clover leaf. Still, don't expect the South Africans to join the Central Powers or anything. They would just trade with Germany and benefit from this. There is no doubt to me that the German colonies in Africa and the country of South Africa would become wealthier due to mutual trade. Both places would become wealthier, of course at the expense of Britain. I would imagine that South Africa would be among the first countries to break away, due to their geographic position, which is far away from the British. This is not to say that any other countries are not looking to abandon the crown. Historically, Britain was broke after the Great War, and now they would also be broke, but additionally, they would owe war reparations to Germany and have to fight wars in order to keep their colonies in check. This would further strain the British economy, which would result in more countries to want to abandon the crown. You can see how this cycle is destructive to the British Empire, and how getting out of it would be almost impossible. One option for Britain would be to sell Nigeria and other colonies to Germany, which would help the British economy. In this timeline, the Liberals would be in charge of Britain, which would have several changes in the post-war world. I cannot predict if Britain would go down this route or not, but I want to explore the more interesting scenario where they want to keep their pride and not sell their possessions to the country that just defeated them in the Great War, aka Germany. As a result, this cycle of self-destruction would follow in Britain, so the Irish would be among the first to take advantage of it. The Irish failed a few years prior in 1916 with the Easter Rising, but by 1921 we can expect the Irish to initiate a similar conflict to the historical Irish War of Independence, which historically succeeded. Since Britain is ruled by the liberals, I think that it's very possible for Britain to grant autonomy to Ireland. I also think that the Irish would remain in the Commonwealth, but would become an equal partner of Britain. The Irish would see a lot of freedoms and they would have their own political parties, parliament, currency, military, and etc. This would be a deal that I think most Irish people would be willing to take, despite George V remaining the country's ruler. The other alternative is that Ireland pursues full independence, but this is not too likely with Britain on their doorstep. This would all happen by the year of 1918, so we are progressing in this timeline. By that year, both France and Britain would have elections. Considering Britain just lost South Africa and gave autonomy to Ireland, while France is fighting an insurgency in Algeria, both ruling parties are going to lose some popularity in favor of some more extremist parties. In the case of Britain, the Liberals, who were led by David Lloyd George, the person who negotiated the Irish autonomy in this timeline, and historically he negotiated the establishment of the Irish Free State. Still, I expect them to keep most of their popularity, but not be able to form a government on their own. I think that the popularity of the Liberals would drop by 10%, where 8% would go to the Labour Party, which now would have 23% of the votes. There would be a new political party called the National Socialist Party, which unlike the one of Germany historically, would be actually Marxist. This is very significant, as they would get 5.8% of the votes in total, with the Conservative Party losing 2% of the votes. This new party is very much pro-war and supported the United Kingdom in the war, with the goal to defeat and destroy the Prussian militarism. It is exactly this political party, which in ideology is similar to the Labour Party, but the key difference is that the National Socialist Party would seek revenge against Germany. Looking at those percentages, no party has the majority and it's unlikely for any of these parties to work together, so there would be political instability. In the previous episode, I mentioned that the Ottoman Empire would declare jihad against the former Entente of France and Britain, but also Russia, with the goal to liberate their Muslim minorities. For the case of Britain, due to their economic and political hardships, but also geographical proximity, I think that Egypt would also rebel and demand full independence. The Egyptians can be supported by the Ottoman Empire, which is right on their doorstep. This is very significant, as the Suez Canal was vital for Britain to reach their crown jewel of India, but also for the Eurasian holdings of Malaya, Australia and New Zealand. This is why the British will not give up on it without a fight, so all British political parties will temporarily work together in order to secure control over the canal. I think that it is out of scope for Britain to try and pacify Egypt fully, as they do not border the country directly. The British used to have Kenya and Uganda as colonies, which would border Egypt, but they were seized by Germany after the Great War. The only way for Britain to reach Egypt is by a naval invasion, and in this alternate timeline they also lost Malta and Gibraltar, so they could not resupply their ships. This makes it almost impossible for Britain to reconquer all of Egypt, but they can at least try to put some pressure on the country and at least secure the Suez Canal. The British plan would be to get Indian and other Commonwealth soldiers to British Somaliland and then to transport them to Egypt and the Suez Canal, which is by far the easiest route. I think that the British would also have a successful landing and defend the area around the canal, but as I said, taking all of Egypt again while the Ottomans are supporting them is close to impossible. I don't need to delay this war any further, as I predict that Egypt would break away from the crown in exchange for payments and special economic rights. The most important thing is that the British would keep the Suez Canal area, renaming it to the British Suez Canal Zone, having this cool flag that I made. Egypt would become an independent kingdom, led by Fahd I. This event is inspired by the historical 1919 Egyptian Revolution, which almost succeeded in our timeline, as the revolution was quelled, but there was implemented a more liberal constitution of Egypt. Since this revolution would be successful, the Wafd Party of Egypt would come to power. They were a nationalist liberal political party, who would fly this flag. This is actually great news for Egypt, as they would finally be independent and not be ruled by another foreign power. The Wafd Party is also likely to increase the Egyptian standard of living, although maybe at the expense of Sudan. As for the French, due to the jihad being called upon them by the Ottoman Empire, they would soon see Morocco also rebel, not just Algeria. Due to France losing most of their iron and coal supply, their production of weapons is limited, hence why they cannot hope to defeat both Moroccan and Algerian rebels at the same time. Considering how important Algeria was to France, being considered part of their core territory, the French would sign a separate peace deal with Morocco and allow them to break free, but they would try to defeat Algerian rebels at all costs. This is the most likely option, as Morocco wasn't really part of France. They were just a French protectorate, being called French Morocco. I can show you these coins from French Morocco, and I have quite a few, ranging from 1 franc to 50 francs. The first 3 coins are from 1951, and the last 2 are a year later, from 1952. In contrast, Algeria didn't have a separate currency like Morocco, or even Tunis, as I have this 1950 Tunisian 20 franc coin. Algeria just used the currency of mainland France, so these coins. I hope that you learned something interesting from this brief coin collection segment. You can check out my coins related channel, where I upload more coin related videos. Now back to this scenario. To conclude, France would give Morocco independence, but would request help in putting down the Algerian rebels, which would be a fair trade. France would be stable, but this would all happen before the 1918 snap elections. There, a lot of things would change. Firstly, as the French Revival Party would grow by 10%, reaching 15% of the total votes. The major change is that the Republican Front would start losing support due to their loss of Morocco, so the Popular Front would grow also by 10% at the expense of the Republican Front. This means that no political party has a majority, which would also lead to a political crisis in France. Supporters of the French Revival and the Popular Front would spark up demonstrations in all French major cities, organizing rallies and getting more supporters. This would in total destabilize France drastically. As of now, both Britain and France are facing a collapsing colonial empire, in addition to having to pay war reparations and having a stagnating economy. But also they are in a political crisis, as no party has a political majority. The trouble for the British I don't think would end there. Due to the Ottoman Jihad, Pakistan is likely to rebel and want to join the Muslim faction of the Ottoman Empire, Persia and Afghanistan. Actually, I want to correct myself in the previous scenario, as I was let know that Persia joining this faction is impossible for several reasons. So I will override this decision and say that Persia is not part of the Baghdad Pact. Still, Afghanistan remains allied with the Ottoman Empire, and the Afghans have a direct border with Pakistan, so it's possible that Afghanistan invades the British Raj as to secure Pashtun majority areas. The Ottoman Empire is not involved in the war, but is supporting Afghanistan and later the Pakistani rebels, who would try to break away from the British and Hindu-dominated British Raj, seeking independence. The thing was that the British Raj was apparently made up of majority Pakistani Muslims. This means that while the Raj would have a big army, these soldiers would simply defect to the Pakistani cause, giving Pakistan a larger army and leaving the British Raj defenseless. Britain still has the Suez Canal, so they can reach the Raj relatively easily, but there isn't a lot for the British to gain in this conflict. Pakistan wasn't as valuable as India, and I mention this because I think that the Hindus would want to be equal partners in the Commonwealth. The Indians would like either independence or to become a dominion, and have their own parliament and set their own laws, but still George V would be the ruler of India. Let me remind you that the year would be around 1921, so Mahatma Gandhi was really active and his book Young India was just released. There the demands were either for independence or for self-rule. Considering that a war of independence would be too costly and Britain will not let go of their crown jewel, I think that the Indian elite and Mahatma Gandhi would go down the self-rule approach. The British would allow for this, as they would still keep India, but most importantly, India can become a partner and fight against the Muslims in Pakistan. The flag of India is likely to become either the Calcutta flag, which was one of the first unofficial flags of India, or they can use the flag that was commissioned by Mahatma Gandhi, which is this flag. The flag features a spinning wheel, which was requested by Gandhi. The color red symbolizes the Hindu people, while green symbolizes the Muslims. The color white was added later, and it's meant to represent every other religion in India. The iconic orange, white and green was first adopted in 1931, so it would take 10 years for India to update their flag. In the meantime, they would use this one, but have a British watermark. Aside from flags, the more important thing is that the Indians and the British cannot defeat the Pakistani rebels because the Pakistanis control the majority of the army. Britain is cautious to pursue total victory, as this can bankrupt the nation, only so they can regain Pakistan. I think that the more likely option is that after several months of fighting, Britain directly takes control over the port of Karachi, while India retains the Kashmir province. Afghanistan will expand its borders and the rest would become the Sultanate of Pakistan. They would adopt the flag of the first Saudi state, but since they are influenced by the Ottoman Empire, the background color would be swapped to red. The British would agree to these terms because they would get to keep Karachi, which at the time was practically the most valuable part of Pakistan. but also the British and the Indians hoped to end this war quickly with minimal losses. This is because if the war were to drag on, the British economy could collapse, while India just became a free country and would rather to consolidate power. The longer the war drags on, the less likely it is for Britain to come out on top. After all, the Germans can support their ally of the Ottoman Empire in this proxy war and weaken Britain. Overall, the British would rather end this war quickly and consolidate power in India, with the goal to keep all of Bangladesh, which was more valuable than Pakistan. The British Empire is slowly collapsing, but at least its control, as the year is 1921, there have already been 5 years since the Great War ended, so Britain is starting to regain its power. Despite this, the British Empire spans on multiple continents and the limited British army cannot be everywhere all at once. South America is finally going to get mentioned and actually become interesting in this scenario. This time, British Guyana is invaded by Brazil, as the Brazilians can seize the opportunity and annex some free land. This may seem a little strange, so I want to mention Portugal before I continue with the South American conflict. Portugal had just joined the Entente in 1916, and the war ended shortly after that. The Portuguese were not punished, and the war ended with a white peace for them. The goal for the Germans was to secure Portugal as an ally, so they tried to befriend them by not taking any of their African holdings. This would succeed, and since Britain has betrayed Portugal several times, most notably seizing Zambia and Malawi from them. This would result in Portugal to abandon Britain and their long-lasting alliance, which first started in 1373. Portugal is also likely to abolish the Republic and restore the monarchy. This is because after the 1910 revolution in Portugal, there were attempts to restore the monarchy, but Manuel II fled to Britain and urged the people not to start a civil war. This is why Portugal remained a republic, but this time with the loss of the war, all could change. Manuel II has already fled to Britain, so he won't be the king. This is because the Portuguese want a ruler that is opposed to Britain and the Entente. The best alternative for Portugal is Prince Johann Georg of Saxony. While this may seem strange, the House of Braganza, which was the ruling house of Portugal, cannot continue their rule. This is because if this were the case, Manuel II would be appointed as the monarch, which the people didn't want. The House of Braganza was apparently also pro-British. This is why I picked a candidate from the House of Wettin, which is a German royal house. The thing is that the mother of Prince Johann Georg of Saxony is Infanta Maria Anna of Portugal. This is perfect for Portugal, as they can get a German monarch, who is also anti-British, to rule the country. This would be approved by the Germans, so they can secure an ally in the Iberian Peninsula. This would also satisfy the Portuguese, who would get a monarch who is anti-British, but also Portugal would join Middle Europa and benefit economically. In Africa, the Portuguese would also benefit from trading with Germany and South Africa, so overall this is a great move for Portugal. Now to mention Brazil, since the Brazilians are taking advantage of a British weakness, they would naturally drift to the German sphere of influence. I see Portugal and Brazil to improve relations and seek to ally with each other, with the two countries uniting as equal being a goal, but this would not happen anytime soon. I think it's fair to say that Brazil would easily conquer British Guyana, but also French Guinea as well. Germany doesn't want to increase world tension, but they are happy to see that France and Britain are weakened, while Portugal and Brazil are getting stronger. I see the Portuguese and the Brazilians to sign a treaty of mutual assistance, where they would increase trade with one another, but also work together for their shared goals. Most notably, this would include a defense clause, where if one country is attacked, the other would join. As to remain in South America, I think it's entirely possible that Argentina quickly grabs the Falkland Islands and South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands. This is possible as the British cannot really resist this, and it's unlikely they would spend money to regain these lands. To be fair, the United States of America may intervene on the side of the British and the French, but this would be very hypocritical. The Monroe Doctrine wants to prevent European colonization of the Western Hemisphere. Technically, Brazil is liberating South America from the European colonizers. This is why I think that Brazil can get away from annexing these territories in America's backyard. Still, relations between the two countries would not be great, and the German influence would increase in South America, which the United States of America would oppose. As a result of these devastating losses for Britain, the United States of America would become the dominant English-speaking country. The dominions of the United Kingdom are still loyal, but they would increase their trade with America. They can even change their currency to dollars instead of pounds. I think that Canada can request control over the British Newfoundland and Labrador or threaten to leave the empire. so these lands would be granted. As the Americans are now the world's largest economy, in addition to not suffering losses in the Great War, they would be even stronger. A financial collapse like the Great Depression is not possible in these circumstances. So while the Americans are growing stronger, they are still pursuing a strategy of neutrality. This is the extent of what I think the British Empire would look like. In red you can see the lands that they lost in this video, and in blue you can see the places where autonomy was given to its people. This is all because the Ottoman Empire called a jihad against the British, French and Russians. The domino effect was activated, hence why Britain was so much in the span of 3 years. Still, the empire is alive, but is on life support and greatly reduced in size. The Ottoman Empire certainly made a lot of enemies, as not only France and Britain hate them, but also Russia, who I'm yet to mention how they would deal with their Muslim population rebelling. Due to the Ottoman Empire's attempt at ethnic cleansing, Bulgarians and Greeks would be hurt by the Ottomans once more, hence why the Salonika Pact is also angry at the Ottoman Empire. In total, these are all the countries that want to partition the Ottoman Empire, while the Ottomans are only supported by Afghanistan and Pakistan. There is going to be not just a third Balkan War, but something much bigger. The Ottoman Empire would be on the chopping block, since they promoted jihad against France, Britain and Russia. This resulted in Egypt, Pakistan and Morocco to get liberated, but I'm also yet to mention the insurgency in Russia. The Russians would still be ruled by the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky, which would start to reform into the Russian state. Due to the Ottoman request for jihad, Central Asia would rebel against the Russian rule. It is vital for Russia to win this conflict, as there are the few remaining oil supplies in Russia. This is because Russia has lost the Baku oil fields to the Ottoman Empire after the Great War. If Russia were to lose, they would need to get oil from the Ottoman Empire, which would strengthen their rival. Since the Russians had time to prepare their military, I would say that due to sheer manpower, the Russians would quickly crush this rebellion. On the other hand, the Ottoman Empire had just set a big target on their nation, as now many countries would be willing to partition them. This is not only because they anger the former Entente by initiating jihad, but also because they're in the process of ethnic cleansing. This would hurt Bulgarians and Greeks especially badly. In this alternate timeline, the Turks would try to consolidate power in Smyrna, which was majority Greek at the time. The Greek people would be deported deep into central Anatolia, with the goal for the Ottomans to populate this region by ethnic Turks. This would obviously cause international outrage, as many Greeks would lose their lives in the process of migrating to their new homes. Under terrible conditions, many of the Greeks would perish, with the death toll starting to approach in the tens of thousands. This is also followed in Constantinople, the Ottoman capital city. This is because at the time, the city had many Greeks living in it, and it was actually almost 50-50 split between Christian and Muslim. The Ottomans would like their capital city to be more Turkish and Muslim, so the Greeks there would be deported, where again many would perish. The Kingdom of Greece is obviously very angered at this situation, with many in Greece demanding for the Greek state to save their brothers and sisters before it's too late. Many in Greece still remember the time when the Ottoman Empire ruled most of the Balkans, and they remember the horrors of living under these conditions. There would be protests in most Greek major cities, with a call to action to invade the Ottoman Empire and annex the Aegean coast. Greece, Bulgaria and Albania are allied, forming the Salonika Pact. Bulgaria also has their minorities in Eastern Thrace, who would also be subject of ethnic cleansing. As a result, it's very possible for the Salonika Pact to strike the Ottoman Empire first, with the goal of liberating their respective people and include them into their respective countries' borders. Now you may say that Albania will not participate in this war, or that they would switch sides just so they can help their Muslim brothers in the Ottoman Empire. This I think will not happen. Albania is still a young country, being formed in late 1912, so by 1925 they would be 13 years old. The Albanians also have a notable Christian minority, so this move would immediately cause a civil war in Albania. And to top it all off, the Albanians were also repressed by the Ottomans, so they are not looking to help them in any way. However, to prevent another Balkan war, the Salonika Pact needs to agree regarding the spheres of influence in advance, or they would start fighting each other right after this war. The Balkan states would agree that Greece would get Constantinople, due to the majority Greek population of the city. Bulgaria is ruled by Ferdinand I, who has historically wanted to conquer the city of Constantinople and rename it to Tsarigrad and be crowned in there. This ambition, however, would for sure doom his alliance with Greece, so even if Bulgaria were to get Constantinople and betray their allies, they can expect Greece and Albania to declare war on them in order to seize some land. But also I can see Romania to get involved, if not even Austria-Hungary, who would wish to expand Serbia-Montenegro. Bulgaria already knew what would happen in this situation, as just 12 years prior to that, Bulgaria lost a lot of land in the Second Balkan War. This is why I think that Ferdinand I of Bulgaria would let Greece have Constantinople, but want compensation elsewhere. This can be in Serbia-Montenegro, where Bulgaria can annex them if something were to happen to the unstable Habsburg Monarchy, to which Greece would agree. Albania would also be compensated with some Bulgarian lands in Macedonia and eventually with Kosovo, if the Salonika Pact ends up fighting the Habsburgs. Finally, Greece and Bulgaria would split eastern Thrace, with Greece taking the Anatolian coast. While this is how the new borders would be drawn in case of a victory, there is only one problem. The problem is that Germany is reliant on oil from the Ottoman Empire, which has practically monopolized this commodity. The Germans are not willing to lose their trading partner of such vital resource, so they would need to get involved or get creative. In the first day of the war, the Salonika Pact would make some solid gains, advancing toward Constantinople, and Greece would land and liberate Smyrna. The Russians would be quick to enter the war, hoping to somehow get Constantinople and secure it first. The Russians would also like to take Georgia, Armenia and most importantly Azerbaijan with their oil fields. This would include even Ottoman Armenia, so the Russians can expand greatly in the conflict. As Russia would enter the war, this would force Persia to enter the war as well, as they would race to reach the Baku oil fields first. The Persians would also like to annex all of Azerbaijan, as they already hold a large Azeri minority within their borders. But also, Persia wants to prevent the Muslim Azeris to be forced to join Christian Russia. Persia would also push to take Mesopotamia and the important city of Baghdad. Seeing this unfold, the Arab portion of the Ottoman Empire is also likely to rebel, as they were opposed to Turkish rule, but also because they can benefit from this move. The Ottoman Empire is practically fighting a war on all fronts, and their only allies are Afghanistan and Pakistan, who are not looking to join this conflict. France and Britain also have distaste for the Ottoman Empire, but they are not officially joining. This is because of the elections in these countries, where the political division will just keep on growing. This is important as during these vital times, the French and the British cannot take advantage over the Ottoman Empire's collapse. In the case of France, parties like the French Revival and the Popular Front are demanding war, and their popularity is increasing at the expense of the Republican Front. By the 1922 elections, I expect France to have 26% support for the French Revival, 38% for the Popular Front, 10% for the Independent Radicals, and only 26% for the Republican Front. The Popular Front and the Independent Radicals have similar political ideas, but even a coalition between the two would not secure a majority, so France is yet again stuck politically. In Britain, the popularity of the Labour Party and the National Socialist Party would increase at the expense of other parties. This would result in the Conservative Party to dissolve, due to them losing any credibility and votes. I expect the Labour Party to become the biggest party in Britain, having around 45% of the votes, with the National Socialist Party getting 20% of the votes. This leaves us with the Liberal Party, which would have around 35% of the votes. Due to political instability, both countries cannot take advantage of this war. Germany is screwed as they want to support their former ally in order to get cheap oil from them, but the situation in which the Ottoman Empire is in looks unsavable. Thus, Germany has two options. The first option is that they join the war on the side of the Ottoman Empire, which would for sure make France and Britain to join the opposite side, wanting to take revenge, leaving Germany in a war on two fronts and in a disadvantageous position. This is because the enemies of Germany would be determined to take revenge, while the German soldiers would want peace and prosperity. Austria-Hungary and Illyria is also unlikely to help Germany, unlike in the First World War, due to their internal problems with the Hungarians. Germany would realize that supporting the Ottoman Empire would be a suicidal mission, so they would maneuver the situation. Germany would throw their full support behind Persia, sending them all the military aid that they would need, in order to capture the Baku oil fields and Baghdad. This is very strategic, as we all know, Britain historically owned most of the oil in Persia and later Iran. This time, Britain would lose the war, so Germany can potentially fill in the power vacuum and assume direct ownership over some Persian oil wells. In doing so, if Persia were to capture all of the territories I just mentioned, Germany would still have a secure way to get their oil from a friendly country, so there would be no need to save the Ottoman Empire. Additionally, Persia and Russia would compete in Central Asia and in the Caucasus, so the Persians are a natural ally of Germany, as they want to prevent Russian expansion at all costs. Now regarding the war, another front would open. While Britain is having trouble politically, India is a dominion and they are willing to invade Pakistan. This is because Pakistan is vulnerable, as they only became an independent country 4 years prior to this alternate war. Their biggest supporter was also the Ottoman Empire, which is right now in the process of being dismantled. There is nothing to prevent India from simply retaking Pakistan, so a successful invasion of the country would follow. Bulgaria and Greece would advance and reach the Chtalja defensive line, which is the Ottomans' last hope for defending their capital city. Russia is having slow progress pushing through the Caucasian mountains, so they would navally invade Batumi and Thrace, which naval invasions would eventually link up and expand. In these uncertain times, the Vilayet of Georgia would declare independence, but the Russians would declare war on them and hope to annex them. The Arabs would claim all of the Arabian Peninsula in addition to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan and the Palestine region. There is a conflict of interest with the Persians, who also claim Iraq in this war, so the two sides would race to reach Baghdad. As for Persia, due to German help and volunteers, as well as geographical proximity, they were able to quickly seize the Baku oil fields and maybe Baghdad. This would anger both the Russian and the Arab sides, as Persia was able to capture their respective claimed lands. In the following weeks, the Salonika Pact would eventually capture Constantinople. This is possible as Russia knows they will not be allowed to keep it even if they capture it, so there is no race for Constantinople. The Russians will not be upset at this, as the Salonika Pact is majority Orthodox Christians, so the two sides can potentially work together as allies in the future. The Salonika Pact also angered Germany as they invaded their former ally, so it's not like the Germans have any influence over the Salonika Pact and by extension the Bosphorus Strait. Russia and Iran would practically split Azerbaijan in half, while the Russians would occupy and later annex Georgia and Armenia. The goal of Russia is also to include the Ottoman Armenian territories, which unfortunately were in the process of ethnic cleansing for years, starting during the Great War. The goal of Russia is to achieve any sort of victory, just so they can calm down their rebelling population. Let's not forget that there were many Bolsheviks in Russia, but in 1924, Lenin would still die, so the potential Bolshevik revolution would take a big hit. There was a possibility of the Bolsheviks to start a civil war in Russia, but their support is low, sitting at around 15%. This means that even if they initiate a civil war, most likely they would be defeated. This is why the Bolsheviks are waiting for another massive war to start, just so they can take advantage of the great powers fighting each other and strike at the right time, hoping to turn the whole world communist. Regarding the war, Britain and India would not have any trouble invading, occupying and annexing Pakistan. The British would also return the port city of Karachi to India as to show goodwill. Still, adding hostile Pakistan back to the British crown would destabilize India, but the Hindus are more numerous than the Muslims, so they can quell the rebellions. India is also a country of equals, so the Muslims would enjoy religious freedom and economic prosperity, which they didn't have in their own state. As a result, the Indians would soon consolidate power over Pakistan. At this point, the war is looking dire for the Ottoman Empire, so they would sue for peace, which would be mediated in Berlin. The Germans would honor the request of the Salonika Pact to take Constantinople, because they don't want the Russians to get the city. Establishing Constantinople as a free city is also impossible due to Greece and Bulgaria already controlling it, and Germany cannot threaten these countries, or a coalition would form against them. As a result, the Germans would have to befriend the Salonika Pact, whose members are also in Middle Europa, the German Economic Customs Union. The Salonika Pact would get all of their claimed lands agreed to upon themselves. This would be a massive victory in the Balkans and strengthen the bond between the Salonika Pact members. Bulgaria didn't gain a lot of lands, but they were promised Serbia-Montenegro in the future, without Kosovo, which would go to Albania. If the Balkan states, including Romania, find themselves at war against Austria-Hungary and Illyria. The Salonika Pact and the remainder of the Ottoman Empire would also do a population exchange, so Greeks and Pontus would be safely relocated to mainland Greece, while Turks in Thrace would be relocated to the Anatolian Peninsula. Russia would annex the Vilayet of Georgia, including Swaziland, but also the entirety of Armenia and only the northern part of Azerbaijan. Persia would annex the remainder of Azerbaijan, getting this cheap oil in the process, while also expanding into Mesopotamia and the Kurdish majority regions of the Ottoman Empire. The Arab states would also annex the Arab majority regions of the Ottoman Empire, but there is a problem, which is Israel, or more specifically, the few Jews in the Palestine region. Since this is the Jewish Holy Land, including the city of Jerusalem, it can cause problems in the Middle East. Germany forcing an independent Israel would be ironic, but also a very bad idea, since this would antagonize the Arabs, with whom Germany wants to have good relations and trade oil. The Germans can therefore either abandon the Jews or give the Palestine region to Egypt. I think giving it to Egypt makes more sense, as the Egyptians are a multi-religious country, tolerant of different religions, which is actually represented in their flag. The Germans can therefore know that the Jews would be safer under Egypt, but also this move will not anger the Arabs too much, as to them another Arabic country is getting this land. Now you may ask, why would Germany care about the Jews, as most of the countries at the time were openly anti-Semitic? Well, this I think is because Germany wants to look like the good guys on the international stage, and allowing a possible genocide to happen will not help them with this image. Another thing you may be wondering is why wouldn't Italy get involved and take some free land? While this is true, the Italian economy is just starting to recover. The Italians would be ruled by the political party Italy First, which suggests that Italy should take a neutral approach and try to grow its economy. Fighting an expensive war just to get some land would not help with the declining standard of living in Italy, at least compared to that of Germany and Austria-Hungary and Illyria. This is why I believe that Italy would not participate in this war, but focus on growing its economy. This is the top priority, because Italy had just gained a lot of land from France, and if there were to be an economic collapse in Italy, not only Italy First would lose power, but these new holdings would rebel. It is vital for Italy to improve economically, or they could risk losing their gains in the Great War. Now to mention the remainder of the Ottoman Empire, which would now be called the Turkish Sultanate. They would completely collapse economically and politically, so this new state would be very unstable. The Germans would step in and fill the power vacuum and stabilize the Turkish Sultanate. The Russians would also do the same, hoping to get an ally in the region. This is vital for Russia, as Persia cannot be befriended, which leaves only the Arab state and the Turkish Sultanate as a possible ally to the Russian people. The Arab state is not connected to Russia, and their foreign goals are not focused elsewhere, so the Turkish Sultanate is the only realistic ally of Russia. This is because the Russians can influence the new country and prevent them from reclaiming the Russian lands that they just gained, but also Russia and the Turkish Sultanate can partition the Persian Empire. The Persians would realize this, so they would join Germany's side in an attempt to invest and befriend the Turkish Sultanate. This would benefit the Turkish people the most, as their neighboring countries would be in a bidding war. Realistically, this would increase the standard of living in the Turkish Sultanate, but also, I think it's fair to say that Germany and Persia would win the state over on their side. This is because Germany is wealthier than Russia, so they can keep their bidding war for longer. The Germans would invest in the Turkish Sultanate, as they would build factories and most importantly, infrastructure. This is important as the railroads would be repaired and new ones would be built. This would allow for Germany to still get oil from the Middle East, but this time from Persia, who would control the majority of the supply. Germany would purchase Persian oil, which would flow through the Turkish railroads built and owned by Germany, then through the Balkans and Austria, finally reaching Germany. In this move, the Germans still secured their vital oil supply, while preventing Russia from taking the Baku oil fields. Germany also has good relations with the Salonika Pact, with the Turkish Sultanate, with Persia and with the Arab state, but also Egypt. This means that Germany maneuvered the situation perfectly and has good relations with all of these states in the Middle East, so they didn't have to save the crumbling Ottoman Empire. While this would benefit Germany, the other European countries of France and Britain, but also Italy, had missed their chance. France and Britain had a problem with political instability, while Italy was too stubborn to take any action. In the case of France, they would have an election in 1926, so a year after this war. This would change quite a lot of things in French politics. The Republican Front has always had a stance against war, ever since France was defeated in the Great War. The thing is that all of the other parties were pro-war, but they were too different ideologically to work together. This would result in all the political parties to attack the Republican Front, with riots destroying buildings owned by the Republican Front. The Republican Front would thus be blamed for France losing in Morocco and not being able to take advantage of the Ottoman Empire's collapse. So this would result in the Republican Front to collapse internally and cease to exist. By the 1930 elections, I expect France to have 36% support for the French revival, 48% for the Popular Front, and 16% for the independent radicals. Still, as you can see, no side has 50% majority, but the independent radicals can join either side to form a stable government. You may think that this is strange, but remember that the independent radicals were a centrist party. More importantly, the party is described as voting with the right on economic interests while voting with the left on political issues. In this timeline, the right is represented by the far-right French Revival Party, which aims to retake the former lands of France as to restore their glory, but also want to unite all the French speakers under one banner, including the ones of Switzerland and Belgium. Some extremist factions are calling for France to extend their borders to naturally defensible positions, and some even want to establish puppet states around France, making sure that France and Paris is never captured again. The independent radicals can join the French Revival and vote with them regarding economic interests, or they can join with the left, which is the Popular Front, and vote with them on political interests. This means that it's possible for the independent radicals to make either the far-right ultranationalist French Revival Party victorious, or they can make the far-left Socialist Popular Front victorious in these elections. Let me remind you that France would be without a functioning government for 8 years already, so the independent radicals would hold a vote on which side they would want to join, only for the sake of improving France politically and economically. The independent radicals are tolerant both to the left and to the right, so they can swing either way, making France socialist or ultranationalist. What would happen is that there would be a vote among the 39 independent radicals members with a seat in the parliament. What would happen is that 19 representatives of the independent radicals would vote for France to swing to the ultranationalist side, while also 19 other people would vote for France to go down the socialist path. This leaves us only with one vote to decide the whole future of France, and this is where you come into the picture. Go down into the video's description and vote regarding which way you would like to see France swing in this series. Whichever path gains the most votes will win. This is how France would drift to the ultranationalist side and establish a police state and tyranny over its citizens, with the eventual goal to declare war on Germany and restore their former glory. Welcome to Project Kaisertum, episode 6, which timeline starts with Germany capturing Paris in 1914 and winning the Great War 2 years later. It would eventually result in these borders, which is now a Hearts of Iron 4 mod, link in the description. This video is the start date of the mod. In fact, the video will explain the war behind everything that happened in the world prior to the mod's start date. But now, let me show you how France could have become an ultranationalist and expansionist power, seeking revenge against Germany. France was suffering from political instability, not having a functional government for 8 years due to no political parties willing to work together. This meant that France lost Morocco and was not able to take part in the Ottoman Empire's collapse. Eventually, the independent radicals of France would vote regarding which side they would want to join, either the ultranationalist French Revival or the Socialist Popular Front. I allowed my viewers to vote regarding which way France would swing, and 57% of you decided to vote for the French Revival, whose goal is to restore the former glory of France, but also to unite the French speakers under one banner. While this is the general idea, some extreme wings of the party are calling for France to annex more territories. That would make it easier for France to defend its core territory and even to establish neighboring puppet states. The goal is to prevent the capture of Paris ever again. Funnily enough, you can call this wing of the French Revival the ultra-nationalists. This is the political party that my viewers chose, so let me tell you how France could look like under this ultra-nationalist dictatorship. First up, the ultranationalists are more likely to be led by Joseph Dernard. He was historically a German collaborator during the Vichy France period, but he also served as an officer in the SS. Most importantly, he was the de facto ruler of the French secret police during the German occupation. This meant that assassinations, chasing resistors and eliminating Jews were unfortunately very common under his regime. While this is disgusting to say the least, I believe that he would turn France exactly what I just described. Political assassinations are going to get very common, which means that the ultranationalist French Revival are going to eliminate the opposition and establish a dictatorship. To justify this disgusting ideology to its people, there is going to be a big propaganda campaign. This would be done mostly through radio and newspapers, where the era of the Third French Republic would be painted as a period of decline. It would be claimed that the French people would have suffered a lot under this regime. To be truthful, they would actually have a point. This is because in this alternate timeline, the Third French Republic would lose the Great War, and they would lose it pretty badly. Another argument against democracy would be that France would have kept Morocco and participated in the wars of Ottoman collapse had it not been for democracy. The Third French Republic also was not able to recover economically, and hyperinflation was rampant due to the war reparations to Germany. You can think of the French Republic like Weimar Germany in our timeline. You can also think of this Ultranationalist France like the Ultranationalist Germany in our timeline. In fact, France would change its official name to État des Français, which would translate to State of French People. This would make sense as the French revival's ideology is one of at least uniting the French speakers under one banner. Renaming the country to emphasize this claim would only help with propaganda in the French territories. Another round of propaganda would follow after that, where it would be broadcasted to the listeners that it's unacceptable for millions of Frenchmen to reside outside of France. This is referring to the French speakers in Belgium, Switzerland, but also Italy, who conquered Nice, Savoy and Corsica, and most importantly, this statement is against Germany and the French speakers in Alsace-Lorraine. Since France would be land for the French people, there are going to be attacks against non-French citizens of the country, especially the Jews. Not only this ultranationalist France is going to start attacking and unjustly arresting its minorities, but they would practically jail all of the opposition. This is because of the French secret police, which would emphasize in eliminating the counter-revolution. As a result, a lot of politicians opposed to the French revival would be eliminated. The remainder of the opposition would flee France and voice concerns from abroad. This news would obviously shock the entire world. Countries would denounce France for their actions, but they would not be willing to enter a war to stop this. Realistically, only one country can stop it, and it's Germany and their allies, who, if they declare war on France with the goal to restore democracy there, would see Russia also join in against them. Austria-Hungary and Illyria would most likely not side with the Germans, and they can possibly go against them. I haven't explored the politics of Austria-Hungary and Illyria too much, but basically Austria would be in a position where they would have to choose to keep either Hungary or Illyria, because trying to keep both would not be possible and guarantee their collapse. This means that the Austrian portion of the empire would get weaker and possibly be annexed by the Germans in the future. Hence why Austria-Hungary and Illyria would take a stance against Germany, or at least not join their side in a potential war. Another country that could rival France is Italy, but as I have explained previously, they would be ruled by a political party called Italy First, whose goal is to improve economically and catch up to the Germans and Austrians. This Italy would prioritize their own goals, so them invading France as to secure a democratic regime abroad would be impossible with their politics. This is why the world would react so negatively, but nobody would do anything about it. This is at least considering the military aspect, but I can see the German Customs Union, which is an economic alliance between these countries, embargo France and Russia. This is because Russia would actually support France in their decisions, and the provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, would shift in a similar ultranationalist path. This means that the Russians would blame the Romanovs for everything and seek to restore the former glory of Russia, if not even reach new heights. At that point, France and Russia would officially ally. The Germans again cannot do anything to stop it for the same reasons as why they cannot force democracy in France. This may seem strange, but remember that Britain would be opposed to the French revival. This is because Britain is ruled by the Labour Party, which is social democratic. This means that had France become a communist or at least socialist state, that Britain could support them. This time, this is not the case, and the Franco-British ties would be greatly damaged with this political situation in France. The French would know that they would need allies, so they would try to befriend Spain in Italy. Regarding Spain, France can try to secure vital resources like coal and steel. This is because France lost a bit of land to Germany and Belgium, but there was located about 70 to 80% of France's coal and steel production. This would mean that France would lack the resources to develop any weapons, limiting their army size. You can see this in this map I found online from 1953, where Germany would seize exactly these lands. If France wants to have a mighty military, they will need either the help of Spain or Italy, who would have coal and steel for trade. Regarding Spain, they are not part of the German Customs Union, so they can freely trade with the French. Another thing that the French revival would do is to possibly screw this possible ally because of ideological reasons. This can happen as France, which is a state for the French people, would double down on their policies of eliminating non-French citizens. This would include a couple thousand Spanish citizens, most likely around the city of Perpignan, but most importantly the whole French Basque country. This would create a whole refugee crisis in Spain, as the Basque people in France would flee across the border and seek revenge in Spain. Due to this pressure, the trading partnership between Spain and France would not last. Even worse, Spain would be opposed to the French regime and seek closer ties with Germany, who also granted them Gibraltar for free after the end of the Great War. The only hope for France is Italy, but this relationship would be highly controversial on both sides. This is because the French revival had claimed as their #1 priority to unite all the French speakers under one banner, but now they would be seeking ties with a country that has at least 500,000 ethnic French speakers. While this may seem strange, let us remember that historically the ultranationalist Germans also collaborated with the Italians, despite there also being around 500,000 ethnic German speakers in the South Tyrol area of Italy. Still, this relationship between France and Italy might work, but be greatly limited in size. Italy's main goal is to improve its economy, and selling overpriced resources to France, who is embargoed by most of Europe, is going to benefit the Italian nation. Italy is also part of the German customs union, so theoretically they can buy these resources on the shared market and secretly sell them to France for a profit. Now, I don't think that the Italian government would actually do this, but I see some individuals trying to make a profit from it. This means that France would get some resources, but by far not enough, and this is not a consistent supply of the vital coal and steel that France desperately needs. France would become increasingly isolationist, and their only ally would be Russia, who has resources but they will have trouble reaching France. This is because Germany, with the help of Finland and the United Baltic Duchies, would control and blockade the Russians' access to the Baltic Sea. By blockade, I mean that the Germans can search the contents of the Russian merchant ships, making sure that coal and iron is not exported. The Russians and the French would have to get creative if they want to strengthen themselves and have a chance at toppling the German hegemony over the European continent. There would be a genius idea, where Russia would find a loophole as to send steel and coal to France. Inspired by a real event in the Cold War, I think that the Russians can start sending crates of food, glass and other non-war materials to France. The Germans would do the mistake of searching the contents of the crates, rather than focusing on the crates themselves. This is because, as I said, France would need coal and steel, just so they can produce military equipment. Well, very conveniently, the crates that Russia would send to France would be made out of wood, which is a replacement for coal, but also they would have steel nails, which can be melted into steel bars. Another workaround that Russia and France would find is that the Germans would obviously search the ships for any steel, but once they don't find any, they will let the ships pass. Then what would happen is that this Russian ship would make its way to France, where it would be literally melted, and its steel would be gathered. I don't have to say that collecting steel from nails and melting shipping vessels is very inefficient, but there are literally no other alternatives for France and Russia. Germany cleverly took the majority of France's steel and coal supply, just so the French can never pose a threat to Germany. France and Russia would find a workaround, and it would be right under the nose of Germany. This chronic lack of steel would force France to be smart in using it. This means that producing millions of rifles would be very inefficient. The French would need to find the best use for its limited amount of steel that they have. For example, a simple rifle can be lost to the enemy, get damaged and etc. Rifles and ammunitions are generally considered consumables, and France doesn't have a lot of steel, so in a potential war with Germany, they would lose in the long run. This is why the French engineers would be tasked with making something very cost effective, and after months of research a prototype would be developed. A very interesting detail is that the Great War ended in 1916, but around the same time tanks were just used for the first time in the war. Historically, the French produced the most tanks, more than all the other countries combined, but historically their tank production ramped up in 1917. The French Schneider CA-1 was first used in 1916, but the concept of a tank as being useful would not be fully researched due to the length of the Great War. This time, France wouldn't be the main builder of tanks, as in 1917 in this timeline, France would lose the war and be stripped from 70 to 80% of their steel supply, so building a tank would be especially more difficult after the peace treaty. Now you may be confused in why I am telling you this, but believe me, you will love me for what I'm about to say. Basically, the French would need to make a way for their steel to be more cost effective. One crazy way of achieving this is to build a super heavy tank. Just think about it. If a tank is made indestructible, then it needs to be built once and it can be used indefinitely. The Char 2C was historically able to sustain directly being hit by artillery HE rounds. This would make the tank practically indestructible, as at the time there didn't exist any technology that could destroy the tank. Just so you know, this tank weighed around 69 tons, which to put it into perspective is almost the same as your mother. Anyway, this is why I think France would make use of their few steel supplies by building super heavy tanks, with the hope of them never being destroyed. Since the Char 2C was a French tank that was historically built during the same time, I think that they can use the same design being used in this alternate timeline as well. The thing is that historically only 10 of these tanks were ever produced, but this time we can expect hundreds at least. The problem of super heavy tanks is that they lack maneuverability, so they can be simply overrun by infantry and destroyed. This means that France would need a professional infantry tasked with protecting these tanks at all costs. Again, all of this would be done in secret and Germany would not have any idea about this until it's too late. This is very ambitious, but it's the only hope for France to achieve a victory over Germany. The war plan would be to use these tanks early in the war and try to capture the steel and coal fields, which would later be used to produce more weapons for the infantry. The French would know that the Germans would eventually come up with a counter to this super heavy tank, but in the early war it would give a big advantage to France. The plan is to gain as much territory as possible, maybe even capitulate Belgium, and then to hold and build weapons with the captured resources, or to negotiate a better peace treaty. The French would know that they would lack resources to win any sort of prolonged conflict, so when you boot up the Hearts of Iron 4 mod, which is still under development by the way, make sure to build the heaviest tank possible if you want to have some extra fun. Regarding other countries, I want to mention Austria-Hungary and Illyria, which would be in deep trouble. This is because the Hungarians are still bitter that they were forced to cede their Croatian holdings and sea access to the newly created Illyrian crown. The Hungarians would demand compensation, either with territory or money. Regarding territory, there is only one way for Hungary to expand, and this is in Romania. Hungary has a historical claim over these lands, as in the early 1300s, the Hungarian state used to include Wallachia and Moldavia as puppet states. The Hungarians would also gain another access to the sea, so they would urge Austria to declare war on Romania. A debate would follow where the Hungarians would argue that they entered the Great War because of the Austrians, and now the Austrians owe the Hungarians a favor. What hurts the Hungarians even more is that they entered the Great War to support Austria, won the war, and yet they lost territory. This is why, understandably, the Hungarians are very angry with the Austrians. While this debate is going on, there would be a discussion of monetary compensation for the Hungarians as an alternative. The thing is that the Hungarians would demand way too much money, and the Austrian portion of the empire is in a vulnerable state. If the Austrians pay the Hungarians, this can bankrupt the nation or prevent them from achieving their long-term goals. Currently, the Austrians would be trying their best to befriend Poland and get them into their sphere of influence, possibly giving them the entirety of Galicia in exchange for an alliance. If the Austrian portion were to run out of money, this would make this goal impossible. As a result, another alternative is to make the Illyrian state pay for the lands they took from Hungary, but there is also another problem. The thing is that this would impoverish the South Slavic people of the empire, which are already the poorest in the whole of Austria-Hungary and Illyria. Making the Illyrians pay the Hungarians would for sure bankrupt Illyria, resulting in them to want to break free. This is why I said earlier that Austria would need to choose between keeping the Hungarians or keeping the Illyrians, but trying to keep both would be very difficult. I assume that once the Hearts of Iron 4 mod is fully finished, you can have an option for which side you want to choose. The thing is that the Hungarians would be looking to abandon Austria and enter a war with Romania on their own. The Hungarians in February of 1930 would stop contributing to the shared coffer of the empire and start acting like an independent nation. Several Austrian nobles would be fired from their positions in Hungary, and the Austrian citizens' properties in the empire would be seized by ethnic Hungarians. This is because the Hungarians would say that the payment is due, and them taking the Austrian properties is a way of them seizing monetary compensation for their losses by force. I want to tell you why Austria-Hungary was set on the path of collapse, no matter the circumstances. They can only prolong their survival, but I don't think they can prevent it. I already mentioned the main problem of the empire, which was that it was multi-ethnic. This wasn't a big problem back in the day, as the Romanian people, for example, didn't have a country that they could call their own. A similar situation is the one with the Polish people in Austria-Hungary, prior to the Great War. The Poles didn't have their own Polish nation, so they wouldn't cause problems in Austria-Hungary. The thing is that when the Central Powers won the Great War in this alternate timeline, a Polish nation was created. Naturally, the Poles of Austria-Hungary wanted to join their respective nation, which problem would be the same as the Italians in Austria-Hungary, but also the before mentioned Romanians, Ukrainians and Serbo-Croatians. This is not to mention the Czech and Slovaks, who didn't have a country of their own, but they desired independence, or at least autonomy, and their own crown under Austria-Hungary. The problem in this alternate history, despite Austria-Hungary winning the war, still remains the same. So, unless Austria-Hungary directly annexes these nations and turns them into a separate crown, their collapse is pretty much guaranteed. To top it all off, the Hungarians are disloyal. This is because, as to create a South Slavic crown, the Hungarians had to cede lands to the Illyrians. They would of course demand compensation, which can be either with territory or with money. Regarding the territory, Hungary can realistically expand into Romania, as during the 1300s they owned Wallachia and Moldavia as puppet states, so they have a historical claim. The Austrians would of course refuse this, so a monetary compensation is theoretically possible between the Hungarians and the Austrians. As I said in the previous episode, Austria would be forced to choose between keeping Hungary or keeping Illyria, but trying to keep both would risk the whole empire to collapse. To outline it again, this is because if Austria were to pay the Hungarians from their own coffer, they may suffer economic hardships. So, Austrian regions like Tyrol, Istria and the entirety of Galicia may leave the empire as they are not Austrian nor Hungarian, but are forced to pay for the creation of the South Slavic crown. That has nothing to do with them. Even worse, if the Austrian portion were to pay, this would be a great insult, because the Galicians would have to pay for it, despite them wanting their own crown and autonomy. So, if Austria were to pay Hungary for their loss of territory, they would need to reform massively and add a possible Galician and Czech crowns, making the country a penta-monarchy. This doesn't sound too appealing, so the other alternative is that Austria forces Illyria to pay for the lands that they took from Hungary. While this would prevent the collapse of the Austrian portion, this would guarantee that Illyria becomes significantly poorer and more radical. If the Illyrians are forced to pay the Hungarians, this might antagonize the South Slavs and only increase their independence desire. Looking at this situation, Austria is in between a rock and a hard place, as they practically have to choose between losing their own territories, but keeping the empire intact, or losing Illyria and also Serbia-Montenegro. The other option is that Austria ignores the Hungarian demands, which would make them leave the empire. There is no right choice, so if you were to play the Hearts of Iron 4 mod as Austria, you will be able to have all of these tough choices and see what they would lead to. Now that we understand the politics and the problems of Austria-Hungary and Illyria, let's see what the course of action would be. In the previous episode, I said that the Hungarians would openly riot and seize properties owned by ethnic Austrians as a form of reparation for their Croatian holdings. This would be in fact the beginning of the end for Austria-Hungary and Illyria. Last time that the Hungarians rebelled was in 1848, and this rebellion was mostly put down by Russian soldiers, as 300,000 of them were sent to help Austria. After that, the Hungarian portion of the empire was put under martial law up until 1867, when there was a Hungarian compromise and the formation of Austria-Hungary. I'm telling you all of this as there was definitely hatred towards the Austrians in Hungary. After all, their lands were under martial law for whole 19 years. Now, in the Hungarian perspective, Austria stole land from them and gave it to Illyria, without paying the Hungarians in any way. This is why I think Hungary would want to leave the Austrians, but they would try to reclaim their Croatian lands in the process. There would be a war between Austria and Illyria, who would face the Hungarians. I said war between Austria and Illyria, which is not the literal sense of the word. Austria would want to pacify the Hungarians and keep the status quo, while Illyria would want to punish the Hungarians and take South Slavic lands from the Hungarian portion, mainly Vojvodina and Banat. Since the two allies of Austria and Illyria would have major disagreements on how to deal with the Hungarians, any cooperation between the two would be very ineffective, hence why the Hungarians can perform so well in this war. The French ultranationalist state would support the Hungarians, at least diplomatically, as the French would want to weaken the former Central Powers. This would be followed by the Russians, who this time will not take the role as the protectors of the Slavic people, as they would allow Hungary free reign over Slovakia and the South Slavic lands. Germany's response to this would be mixed. Some would see it as an opportunity to take Austria and Bohemia, while others would want to keep the status quo, as a major empire disappearing would change the balance of power in the region quite a lot. Due to these mixed German responses, no official statement would be made in the first key moments of the civil war. Regarding the Austrian minorities, they would quickly seize the opportunity to also declare their independence, claiming it as their right to join their neighboring countries. This would be first seen with the Italians in South Tyrol and Istria, who would form the independent countries of Italian Trentino and Italian Istria respectively. These countries would secure their independence quite effectively, as they are far away from the action, but also Austria would not retaliate against them, out of fear that Italy might defend them and join the opposite side. As a result, these two Italian states would be de facto independent, but not be recognized by any other country. Not so long after that, they would vote to join the Kingdom of Italy, which, while being neutral and kind of isolationist, would accept them. This would also satisfy Austria, as this would prevent the Italians from joining the opposing side and maybe taking the Adriatic coast by force. The Poles and Ukrainians would also do something similar, as these people would rebel and want to join their respective countries. The problem was that there was no clear border, so the Poles would claim this land as theirs, while the Ukrainians would claim this land as theirs. While this is going on, France and Russia would covertly support Poland, as the country is led by Cyril I, the fourth son of Ferdinand I of Bulgaria. Technically, Poland is not a German puppet politically, but they are very tied to them economically. Of course, France and Russia would not announce their support publicly or send too much equipment to Poland, as to not cause any suspicion. The Austrian Empire is really starting to crumble, and even the Czechs are rebelling and have full control over the cities of Pilsen and Prague, but not Brno and the countryside. The Romanians would see their biggest opportunity, as they would want to seize ethnic Romanian lands in Transylvania and Banat, so the arrival of Hungary would be in a very vulnerable state. The thing is that the Romanians cannot just join the war and annex some free land. This is because if they do without the consent of Austria, it could be seen as the Romanians stealing Austrian land. Now, let us be real, the Romanians are very good at stealing, so it's possible to happen. Jokes aside, Austria would want to return to the status quo, which is looking increasingly unlikely. Still, Romania has good relations with the Salonika Pact, containing Albania, Greece and Bulgaria. Their goal is to prevent any great power from controlling the Balkans, so they would stay united as to keep the foreign invaders out. Bulgaria was promised future control over Serbia-Montenegro, excluding Kosovo, which would go to Albania. This promise was made by the Greeks during the wars of Turkish collapse in 1925, so 5 years prior to that. The Romanians and the Bulgarians, but also the Albanians, would have an interest to strike the Habsburg Monarchy and seize their land. The Greeks are not so enthusiastic about this, so they would negotiate to stay out of the conflict, just because they want to consolidate their new gains and not risk losing them. This is why I would say that there is quite a lot for the Salonika Pact to gain, making their involvement to the upset of Austria and Illyria inevitable. At this point, Germany is really scratching its head, as just like how the Ottoman Empire, their former ally in the Great War, collapsed, the same fate is upon the Habsburg Monarchy. This is important, as despite the Ottoman Empire's collapse, Germany managed to secure good relations with all of its breakaway states. So, Germany maneuvered the situation quite perfectly. I mention this because of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which is a net positive for the Germans, as they gained new allies and lost a bit of land to Russia. There was no need for Germany to involve itself and try to save the Ottoman Empire, which would make a coalition to form against them. This situation to me is quite similar, so the Germans can make sure to have good relations with all the states that would be involved in the war and not have to help Austria out in this ridiculous war. The war would progress, as the Polish rebels would be supported by the Polish kingdom. The Austrians will now risk a war with Poland if they retaliate against the Polish rebels, so the situation for Austria is becoming too tricky. Now, if you remember initially, the Ukrainians are led by Archduke Wilhelm of Austria, better known as Vasil Vyshevani. Despite him being a Habsburg, he was a Ukrainian nationalist and would take this chance to expand his nation. Considering the situation, I don't think that it's too crazy to suggest that Ukraine enters this war formally. After about a week of warfare, I see Bulgaria completely overrunning Serbia-Montenegro, where the people would be enthusiastic to get rid of the Habsburg leader, but their future under Bulgaria is also uncertain. I also see Romania making solid gains in Transylvania, while the Hungarians are holding both the Austrians and suppressing any possible Slovak uprisings. Austria is also trying to keep Bohemia intact, so they're not too effective in this war. Finally, I see Poland and Ukraine to occupy Galicia, but they will soon have an argument regarding the exact borders. At that point, Austria would need a humiliating peace treaty, where they would at least keep something, while the Hungarians also want peace with Austria, as they want to focus on Romania. This is how the peace treaties would look like, which would be mediated in Berlin. The Poles are going to get most of Galicia, including the city of Lvov, while Ukraine would get a smaller part of the region, but they would be promised a lot of future Russian land. The Ukrainians should take the deal, as they rely on Germany for protection against the Russians, so they have no choice. Regarding the Balkans, Illyria would take the opportunity to break free. They could theoretically remain under the Habsburgs, but the South Slavs would not benefit from this. I see Illyria becoming a free kingdom, with a king being possible to come from the House of Savoy, which is the Italian one. The Italians can not only gain Trentino and Istria, but also a protectorate over the Kingdom of Illyria. This is because the Bulgarians have annexed Serbia-Montenegro, which I am yet to mention. This would force the Illyrians to be initially isolated, so the Italian protection would help them against Austria and Bulgaria. In reality, this is not just a guarantee of independence by Italy, but the Italians would have ambitions to seize some of their lands and puppet the nation, which is already in the process, as there is a potential Savoy candidate on the throne of Illyria. As I said, Bulgaria and Albania would partition Serbia-Montenegro, where I assume that the Serbians would not integrate too well in these countries, so they would cause problems and paralyze them from within. Austria would end up keeping Bohemia and renaming itself to Austria-Bohemia, and they would use this cool flag that somebody made on Reddit. As for the Hungarians, they would continue their war with Romania, where the Hungarians would want total victory. The Romanians would be supported by the Salonika Pact, who would wish to include Romania into their alliance, consolidate power and remain neutral from foreign affairs. I think it's fair to say that the Hungarians would be on the losing side in these circumstances, but out of pride they would not sign a peace treaty that would make them lose land. Eventually, the Romanians would occupy most of Transylvania and threaten to take the city of Cluj. At that point, the Hungarian parliament would vote to end the war, as if they continue, they would lose even more territory. Still, the Hungarians would keep northern Transylvania and most notably the Hungarian populated areas in Brasov. This is also called Zsikili land, referred to this area in our timeline. The Hungarians would be forced to peace out, as the Slovaks would also rebel, but also the South Slavs, so it would be a suicide mission for Hungary to keep this war going. After the peace treaty is signed, the parliament in Hungary would be dismissed and the military would take over. They would suppress any possible rebellions and swear to destroy Romania and retake Transylvania. Hungary would become a brutal police state, which would be similar in ideology to France and Russia, making them a natural ally of these countries. The French and Russians would also seek revenge, just like the Hungarians. Additionally, these countries have very similar enemies, which is Germany. I think that the French, Russians and Hungarians would formally ally, signing the Axis of Paris, Budapest and Moscow, or just the Axis of Revenge for shorter. The Germans would protest this alliance and force them to dissolve, which would obviously happen and we would all live a happy and prosperous life. No, they would not dissolve. So, what's next? Well, I think that Germany would be fairly concerned. So far, the Germans only have a customs union, which is an economic alliance, but the Germans lack a military alliance. Most notably, Germany would do something that would forever change the course of this alternate world. As to protect Austria-Bohemia and make sure that they don't fall to any extremist ideologies or fall victim to the Hungarian aggression, Austria-Bohemia would be puppeted by Germany. In a way, they would be independent, but practically they're economically and militarily tied to Germany. I don't see the Germans directly annexing them, as this would create more harm than good. For example, the Habsburgs would still rule Austria-Bohemia, with Charles I possibly remaining in charge, but I doubt it. The thing is that the Ukrainian king is also a Habsburg, so if Germany were to annex Austria-Bohemia, this would break the personal union between them and Ukraine. Now, I think that even if this were to happen, I don't think that the Ukrainians would want to leave and go down their own path, as they would be quickly invaded by Russia in this case. Still, mostly in order to keep legitimacy and their good image, Germany would puppet Austria-Bohemia. This German expansion, although not officially seen as annexing, is practically the same. Austria-Bohemia would fight on the side of Germany and contribute their soldiers to the German army, as the two countries would have a shared army and economy. This would greatly upset the Axis of Revenge, who would in turn demand that Austria-Bohemia remains a free country. The German side, however, would not back down and keep their position, while starting to improve relations with the Italians and the Salonika Pact. Italy would actually declare official neutrality, as they don't want to be part of any future wars. This is understandable, as they're in the process of getting off Illyria, but also the Italians got pretty much everything that they could ever want in the continent of Europe, uniting most of the Italian speakers under one country. There is basically nothing for Italy to gain, but everything to lose in a potential war. The Salonika Pact would invite Romania, as they want to better protect themselves from Hungarian and Italian aggressions in the Balkan Peninsula. The French would see that their threat was not taken by Germany too seriously, so they would make an even bigger demand. The French would demand that Germany leaves Austria-Bohemia, but most importantly Alsace-Lorraine. If this is not done by the 1st of September 1932, the Axis of Revenge would be in a state of war with the Germans. This may seem odd, but it's actually the only chance for France and Russia to topple the German hegemony and their only chance to reclaim their lost territories. The French have also been producing a lot of super heavy tanks, with the idea that once they're built, they would never be destroyed and can be used indefinitely, allowing France to win despite less resources. The war plan of France would be to use their tanks to capture Strasbourg and cross the Rhine River, while also going along the Maas River and to cut Belgium away from Germany, which can be later safely taken. France also knows that Italy is content with their gains and that they will not get involved, while Spain is too divided politically between the ultranationalists and the socialists, just like how France was a few years prior. This means that France can only focus on Germany. Now, Germany would call the bluff of France and not pull out of Austria-Bohemia and Alsace-Lorraine, so France and Germany would be in a state of war. Very quickly, this war would include Russia on the French side, going against Germany and all of its puppet states. The politics of France in this alternate timeline are similar to the ones of ultranationalist Germany, but the key difference is that there is no appeasement for France. The French cannot demand any land without having a coalition to form against them, and even with the help of the Russians and the Hungarians, they would have to back down. Last episode, Austria-Hungary and Illyria collapsed, so Germany took the opportunity to integrate Austria, which didn't go well in France. This is because the Axis of Revenge knew that Germany would outscale them soon, which is why the French initiated this war this early on. The French gave an ultimatum to Germany, and when the Germans refused, war was brought to all of these countries. Let me tell you how this war would finish. This is a super heavy tank that France has been producing, and they have around 1000 when the war rolls around. The ultimate gamble is that France needs to build them once and they can be used indefinitely. As of right now, France doesn't know if Germany has a counter to this weapon, so it's a big gamble for the French. Technology would progress and make these tanks obsolete if France were to delay the war. The French also have a solid strategy, which consists of taking the city of Strasbourg, which would greatly boost morale in France, but also to cross the Rhine River, so they can later expand into Germany proper. After this is secured, the French would relocate these tanks and go along the Maas River, where they can split Belgium into two and take the undefended half. This is a big gamble for the French and the Russians, so let's see if this would pay off. You can actually try the same in the Hearts of Iron 4 mod based in this series, where you can play as France and try to destroy Germany, which is plenty of fun. As I said, these are just the plans for the French army, so let me tell you how they would be executed. On the 3rd of January 1932, there would be big fog in the province of Alsace-Lorraine, which is perfect for the French, as the Germans cannot spot the super heavy tanks just yet. Then, out of nowhere, the tanks would advance toward the city of Strasbourg, destroying everything in their way. The Germans would perform poorly, as they didn't expect to be at war this soon, but also because of suboptimal weather conditions. There is going to be a battle for Strasbourg, where the French super heavy tanks would be tested directly into urban warfare. They would prove extremely effective in urban warfare, as the Germans are not willing to use artillery in the city and risk bombing their own citizens. For the same reason, airplanes carrying bombs would not drop them on the French super heavy tanks, as they can accidentally bomb their own citizens and lose war support. This would encourage the French High Command, led by Charles de Gaulle, who I assume in this timeline would be like Erwin Rommel, i.e. not sympathize with the ruling ideology, but want to serve his country. De Gaulle would be like Rommel in another sense of that he can become a tank genius and prove himself quite effective. Regarding the Battle of Strasbourg, the city would be besieged and supplies would be cut off from the mainland, so the governor would surrender the city as he feared that the super heavy tanks would flatten it. The Germans were still relying on older Great War tactics, and they didn't innovate too much. Still, unfortunately for the French, the German airplanes could destroy a super heavy tank, only if they drop a bomb directly on top of it. While this sounds easy, it's actually extremely difficult, so the Germans cannot reliably counter the French tanks. Moving on to the Eastern Front, I want to mention Poland. They can become like Francoist Spain of our timeline, trading with the Germans, but not joining the war directly. There are several reasons why the Polish people would want to remain out of the Second World War. First up, the Poles would have to fight the Hungarians, but the two countries are historical allies. For example, in our history during the Second World War, the Hungarians didn't attack the Poles in late 1939, despite them being allied with the Germans. Obviously, this wasn't a big problem, but this just served as a nice gesture between the Poles and the Hungarians. This alliance between Poland and Hungary can even be observed today. This is the first reason, but the other reason is that the Polish people would be split on the issue. One side would want to join Germany and gain all of Belarus as compensation, which can be repopulated by Poles, especially the ones who reside in Germany. The other alternative is that Poland, which is a free nation, although heavily influenced by the Germans, can switch sides and join the Russians, in an attempt to gain the before mentioned Polish majority lands in Germany by force. This would however make Poland allied with Russia, who is vocal about retaking their previous territories and even reaching new heights. This is why Poland would be hesitant to join the war, so in the first few months they would remain out of it, but trade with the Germans. The Russians are not going to attack Poland, as they would prefer to deal with the Baltics and pacify Finland first. The United Baltic Duchies would be the first target of the Russian army, as these Baltic countries are very weak and prone to collapse. This is because of the heavy Germanization program, where the Germans are basically colonizing the region and suppressing the Latvians, Estonians and Lithuanians. These Baltic people would obviously not like it, so they would be at a crossroad. They can rebel, but this would mean that the central government collapses, making it easy for the Russians to invade all of it. Then the fate of these people would be in the hands of the Russians, which they do not remember fondly. The other alternative is that Germany is asked to pull out of the United Baltic Duchies, and these countries can still be aligned with the Germans, but have their own separate states. At this point, the Germans would have no other option but to agree with this demand, as they failed to see the cracks in the United Baltic Duchies and how much its people desired independence. This is why the United Baltic Duchies would split into three countries, with Germany still occupying Riga for the time being. To the Russians, however, this would be a welcome change, as they can easily conquer the region. This is because in the United Baltic Duchies, German was the main language, and all of the other languages were a secondary language. Thus, with the collapse of the United Baltic Duchies and with the formation of Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, these people would have a sense of pride, so they would use their own language instead of the German one. The problem is that these languages don't have a lot of things in common, so communications between these troops on the front lines would be limited, as they're too proud to use their own language, rather than the German one. This is why I believe that sooner or later the Russians are going to steamroll the Baltics, due to poor communication and political instability on the enemy side. I would predict that in this situation only Lithuania would hold, for now. As for Finland, Russia would aim to push the Finns away from St. Petersburg, but not aim to capitulate the country, as the cost is not worth it. Since the war started on the 1st of January, you already know how this winter war would go for the Russians, but eventually, after suffering way more casualties than needed, the Russians would occupy some land and redistribute their soldiers to other fronts. Since Kiev is right on the border with the Russians, the city would be bombarded easily and eventually would be taken, as Germany cannot spare enough forces to be everywhere all at once. The Germans would ask the Poles to use their railroads to get to Ukraine faster, which would be granted. The Germans know how important Ukraine is for Russia, as if Ukraine were to fall, this would directly link Hungary with the Russians, where the Hungarians as of right now are disconnected from their allies and have no sea access from which they can get help. As for the Hungarians, I assume that they would control Burgenland before the war starts. So, the Austrian capital city of Vienna is just 25 kilometers or 16 miles away from the Hungarian border, making its capture inevitable. I want to quickly mention Japan, which is more than likely to join the side of the Axis of Revenge, seeking to take the German Pacific Islands, Qingdao, but also the eastern parts of Papua Island. I will not cover this front too much, but remember that it's happening. I think that the United States and other countries can at this point embargo Japan, and by extension the rest of the Axis of Revenge. Zooming out, this is the situation as of right now. Strasbourg has fallen and the super heavy tanks of France are paying off, with Finland not being a threat, and Russia occupying most of the Baltics, but also just starting to enter Ukraine. As I mentioned, Hungary would be effective in taking Vienna, but would be cautious to go any further. Previously, in the comments, people have said that the Germans would win very easily, but as you can see from what's happening on the front lines, they were caught by surprise, fighting against a weapon that they cannot counter effectively. This is not to say that the Germans are going to perform poorly by any means, but their enemies are more prepared for the war. The Axis of Revenge also has the advantage of starting the war at their own terms, way before Germany is effective in their mobilization efforts. This war came to Germany as a lightning from a clear sky. Still, Germany will militarize the border and hold effectively, preventing any further enemy advances. The Germans are going to focus on Belgium, sending many of their tanks to the region, with the goal to capture Paris quickly and then to focus on Russia. These tactics are almost identical to the ones in the Great War, so the German war mentality is still one of almost 2 decades prior. The Germans will defend Belgium but would neglect the Ardennes forest. This is because they thought that the terrain was impossible for the French super heavy tanks, so they wouldn't need a lot of resources to hold there. The Germans also believed that the major city of Lille was the next target of France, which is reasonable to assume so. The French lost Lille to Belgium in 1916, after the Great War, and would want to retake it for a morale boost. The French super heavy tanks are also quite effective at urban warfare, as it was shown in Strasbourg. So Germany will fortify the city and wait for France to start their advance. If you got the subtle hint that the Germans would neglect the Ardennes forest, as they didn't think that the French could march super heavy tanks through there, you will know what's coming next. France will do exactly the opposite of what Germany had expected and march through the Ardennes forest, putting many of the German armored divisions at risk of being encircled. This would obviously panic the German High Command, who was again caught off guard. Not so long after that, France will complete their encirclement and would reach the border of the Netherlands. Another cool detail is that Dunkirk would be in the hands of Belgium at the time, so the Germans could practically get Dunkirked in this alternate timeline. The French would then focus on assaulting the encircled divisions in Belgium, hoping to take much of the German tanks for themselves, but also to prevent them from escaping, which would greatly weaken the German army. Cracks are starting to show in the Wehrmacht, and if anything is not done fast, they can lose the war before it has even started. Right now, Germany doesn't have a lot of options to secure their encircled troops, as they can request that the Netherlands allow the Germans to escape through their railroads, but despite the great relations between the Dutch and the Germans, this request would be too much, as then the Netherlands would be the next on the chopping block. The last hope for Germany is Britain, where the two countries would have favorable relations. This is because Britain is led by the Labour Party, which is a social democratic party. The Germans are led by the SPD, which is also a social democratic party, making the two countries very similar in terms of ideology. The British are also opposed to the far right, and even the National Socialist Party of Britain would get repressed. Now you may think that Britain and Germany would be on bad terms because of the Great War, but I don't think that this would be the case. Despite the similar political ideology between the British and the Germans, I don't think that the British would hold a grudge against the Germans. This is because the only British lands that Germany directly annexed were Uganda and Kenya. Britain was Gibraltar as it was given to Spain, Malta was given to Italy, Cyprus was given to Greece. Ireland fought a war to become a dominion, South Africa fought for its independence, and Brazil took British Guyana. Germany as of now is not allied with any of these countries, so the British I think have no reason to hold a grudge against the Germans. And even if they declare war on them and are guaranteed to win, they can only retake Uganda and Kenya. But of course they would expand some more, but this is besides the point. The British and Germans can also have a shared enemy, which is the Japanese, who aspire to dominate Asia and rival British India, Australia, New Zealand, Malaya and Hong Kong. I cannot tell you if the British would help the Germans by safely escorting the German troops out of Dunkirk, so this is up for interpretation. Let's say that most of the German army gets crushed by the French, so France has almost captured all of Belgium. It should go without saying, but this is not meant to be taken seriously, remember that, especially during the end of the video. I just want to make the most interesting scenario possible. This is why I will literally nuke the fridge and make the scenario more interesting, but sacrifice some realism. Keep in mind that I'm planning to do all endings Kaisertum to explore all possible endings. This is just one of them. I am yet to mention Italy, which has a personal union with Illyria. The Italians have a lot to gain from this war, but not in the terms of uniting the Italian speakers, which they have already mostly done. I think that Italy can choose to strike the Salonika Pact, with the goal to expand Illyria at the expense of Bulgaria. But also, Italy has the Dodecanese Islands, so they can expand into Crete, and perhaps Italy can take Corfu and Albania, securing control over the Adriatic Sea. I would say that while every major European country except Britain is busy fighting each other, the Italians would choose to strike the Salonika Pact, which would be caught off guard. The Romanians I don't think would be too interested in fighting in this conflict, as there is nothing for them to gain, and they risk suffering out of casualties, rather than protecting the border with Hungary, who is increasingly more likely to strike Romania. This would put the Romanians into a position where they can abandon the Salonika Pact and fight on the side of the Germans, or to help the Salonika Pact and fight Italy, but risk a war with Hungary. Since the Germans are lacking major military victories, I think it's fair to say that Romania will stick with the Salonika Pact, who would be in deep trouble. The Salonika Pact I assume would quickly lose control over Serbia-Montenegro, either due to rebellions or simply to Italian invasions. The Italians are also going to start harassing the Greek coastline, so the war is looking dire for the Salonika Pact. The Turkish Sultanate is a German ally, although not officially in the war, so them helping the Italians is not too plausible to happen. But if you play the Hearts of Iron 4 mode of this series, you can definitely expand the Turkish Sultanate. Still, these two wars would be going on in parallel, but I assume that they would soon merge. Italy would be kicked out from the German Customs Union, while also the Germans have good relations with the Salonika Pact. The problem of the other alternative, which is the Italians join the Germans, which is not a big problem, but the Salonika Pact joining the Axis of Revenge is not possible. This is all because of Transylvania, as the two rivals of Hungary and Romania would have to fight on the same side, hence why I think that the Salonika Pact would prefer to join the Germans, and Italy will cooperate with the Axis of Revenge, but not join them officially. Additionally, Italy and Hungary would border each other, making the front lines a lot more interesting. The Italians are also willing, in case of victory, to establish an Austrian protectorate, greatly expanding Italian influence and making the country a formidable major power. This would give us these sides of the war, which makes more sense. Italy would offer Hungary all of Romania as an alternative to the Croatian coastline, which I think would be accepted by the Hungarians. As for the Balkan front, the Salonika Pact would be on the defense, and they would lose more land, as Hungary is retaking most of Transylvania, while Bulgaria already lost Serbia-Montenegro, and it's looking increasingly more likely that they would lose Macedonia, which can become disastrous for them, the Greeks and the Albanians. At that point, I think that the Italians would have a successful naval invasion of Albania, where they would reach Tirana and force the king to abdicate, where after that an Italian would be put on the throne of Albania. Thus, Albania would switch sides and not lose any territory, and they can even gain some more from Greece and Bulgaria. This is why I think that Albania would enter a personal union with Italy and be forced to switch sides. Now it is time to mention Britain again, who now has the opportunity to retake Malta, but also quite a lot of French colonies. Going further, as Japan is a threat to Britain, the British can potentially join the Germans and also have gains from Japan, so the British entry into the war on the German side is looking increasingly more likely. I cannot tell you what the canon event would be that would make Britain join Germany, but to me under these circumstances it looks inevitable, so I would allow it right now. Egypt joining the opposite side as to regain the Suez Canal is possible, but for now I think it's too unlikely. The world has a lot of opportunities to become crazy in terms of this alternate Second World War. South Africa would be greatly angered at this, as they hope for Germany to go to war with Britain, just so South Africa can expand into the Dominion of Natal. As of right now, South Africa would remain neutral, despite them being a German ally. At the same time, Poland would be inevitably invaded by Russia. The Polish people know that the Russians want to incorporate and annex them into their Neo-Russian Empire, so there is no point between a Polish-Russian cooperation. As to mention some other countries, the United States would prefer to stay out of the war, but they would continue to trade with the Europeans. Portugal and Brazil have good relations and have been increasing cooperation between the two. As of right now, they are also not threatened, so they will remain out of this war. The interesting fact to mention is that Portugal is a German ally, being in the German Customs Union, but also having a member of the House of Wettin on the Portuguese throne. This is interesting because Portugal was also anti-British at the time, entering and losing the Great War because of them. But now, with this British-German alliance, the Portuguese and Brazilians would damage their good relations with Germany, securing more neutral countries. Still, this alternate Germany is a force to be reckoned with, as they would prevent France from advancing any further and to establish defensible positions. The strength of the French super heavy tanks is now limited, as they're good on the offense, but due to terrain and rivers, there is nowhere to go. Again, let me remind you that this is unrealistic, but I'm building an exciting story. This is why, as to spice things up, I think that France would want to bypass the German defenses and attack the neutral Netherlands, where the French would have a really big advantage. Remember that the French super heavy tanks are very effective in urban combat, so they can easily take the Dutch major cities and bypass the German defenses, going straight into the Rhineland if all goes well. This is a big gamble, but one worth taking. The war is still anybody's guess, but there would be something very massive. The thing that I'm talking about can potentially change the course of the war and maybe the entire world. Earlier in the video I mentioned that Germany could destroy the French super heavy tanks only if they accurately drop a bomb from an airplane on top of it. This is extremely difficult to say the least, as the airplane is moving at a fast speed, but they also have to hit a moving target accurately. This is not reliable, and only 0.4% of the bombs dropped would connect successfully with the French heavy tanks. This is why the German top priority would be to make something that is more efficient in destroying the French super heavy tanks, on which France basically relies to win the war. Since the Germans won the Great War, they never became ultranationalists themselves, so all of the top scientists never went to the United States of America. There was no brain drain in Germany. Historically, a lot of German scientists worked on the Manhattan Project, and I think that Germany could have a similar project in this alternate timeline. But it wouldn't be aimed at wiping out entire cities, but just a tank and the surrounding infantry. Being smaller in scope is perhaps easier to achieve, and although perhaps unrealistic, I want to mention it. This is because Einstein and Oppenheimer perhaps never go to the United States of America and would do research and development in Germany instead. There would be a prototype with a blast radius of just 100 meters, or the rough diameter of a football field, which would be first dropped on the French super heavy tank divisions advancing into the Netherlands. This prototype would take 2 months to build, and was able to take down 4 French super heavy tanks, making it extremely cost effective. This is because Germany can build more of these and destroy tanks faster than the French can produce new ones. The war is starting to shift with the discovery of atomic energy, which once again I don't care if this is super realistic or not. I am suggesting that an atomic bomb literally 1000 times smaller than the one used historically in Japan is dropped, which seems doable with all the German scientists back home, despite the year being 1932, while progressing into 1933. Yet again, the war is looking without a clear winner, as Germany managed to find an effective counter to the French super heavy tanks, who were bringing havoc upon the Germans and were enjoying easy victories. The war is not yet lost or won by either side. First up, I want to mention the Mediterranean situation, where the British cannot use the Suez Canal, as without Malta and Gibraltar, it would be too dangerous for the British ships to pass through. Then this would mean that for Britain to supply and be supplied from their colonies would need to go all around Africa, which is more costly. I want to tell you that the French and the Italian navies combined can rival the British on its own, so I think it's possible for these countries to try to starve Britain by blockading the home islands, or at least controlling the English Channel. The thing is that Britain is allied with Germany, so with their navies combined I don't think that it's too possible. The Americans, however, would still freely trade with the British, but this would all change with the civilian ship being accidentally destroyed by the French submarines. This will not bring the Americans into the war, but would anger its population. Lend-lease from the Americans could soon be secretly sent to Britain and Germany, as the Americans and the American public are firmly on their side. As for Europe, I would have Finland sign a separate peace treaty and leave the war, mostly due to internal pressure. This is because Finland would be a kingdom led by a German king, which the people of Finland would like to change. There is going to be a revolution that would oust the king from power, turn Finland into a republic and sign a peace treaty with the Russians. While all I just mentioned is good news for the Axis of Revenge, I am yet to mention Germany and their atomic experiment, which was successful on the battlefield. The French were surprised by it, but they didn't care too much, as the prototype only destroyed 4 super heavy tanks, with there being around 1000 more in stockpile. The French are also yet to attack the Netherlands, and the French High Command believe that since the super heavy tanks are strong in urban combat, they would have an easy time taking over the Dutch major cities. Then they would simply march into the Rhineland and take the German industry and population, forcing a ceasefire. These were the hopes of France, and understandably, they were thinking that not all yet is lost. Additionally, the Germans only dropped one of these atomic bombs on the front lines, so the French didn't know if there is more to come, and how many of these bombs Germany could produce. To the ultranationalists and their propaganda, they would say that this was a one-time occurrence, and that there is no way for Germany could do it again. This is why the French armored divisions would arrive in the south of the Netherlands and try to take the city of Breda. The Germans, together with the British army, would reinforce the city and await for the French advances. As this would be happening around the summer of 1933, there is already a year and a half since the war started, but progress is extremely slow for both sides. France would enter the city with super heavy tanks, but this time the mindset of the Germans would be different. Before the discovery of the atomic bomb, the Germans were focusing on trying to destroy the super heavy tanks, but now they would have a reliable way to do so they can focus on something else. Germany still has the air advantage, so this gives them great visibility and the ability to bomb enemy positions. I think that the Germans and the Brits could also try to cut the French supply off, rather than to fight them directly, which would be more difficult and costly. The occupied Belgians would be instructed to rebel against the French, making the encirclement possible. For France, this means that resupplying these fuel-consuming machines is close to impossible, so they would have to face a difficult choice. One option is to try to break free from the encirclement and retreat, but there is a big problem with that. The thing is that the super heavy tanks would have to retreat to the Dutch flatlands, and considering that the weather is clear, the German and British Air Force could easily bomb the tanks and destroy hundreds of them. This is why the French High Command would do the second option, which is to fight and win decisively. They would hope that another army would help them break free, so this is a high risk and high reward situation. The super heavy tanks would enter the city of Breda, but as I said earlier, Germany and Britain would be prepared, as they would put concrete blocks and defenses on the roads, slowing down any French advancements. This would mean that the more time the French lose in capturing the city, the higher chance the super heavy tanks have to run out of fuel and become useless on the battlefield. This means that France would need to have a quick victory or lose everything, as due to the Belgian rebellions, their reinforcements are considerably slowed down. I think it's entirely possible for Germany to also surprise the French and use their atomic weapons on the tanks, destroying many of them in the process. The goal for the Germans would be to destroy just a few of these tanks, but this would instill panic in the French divisions and would make them disoriented or make them surrender. As I said, this atomic bomb is literally 1000 times smaller and weaker than the one dropped on Japan. Right now, fighting is happening in the city of Breda, and with 15 kilotons, which is the historical bomb dropped on Japan, it would wipe out the entire city of Breda, as you can see from this simulation. The thing is that since this bomb is literally 1000 times smaller and weaker, this would actually look like this. We will ignore the green radius, as this is radiation, the long-term effects of which are still mostly unknown at the time. You can clearly see that the German atomic weapon can destroy a whole street, and they can expect to take down a few French super heavy tanks with it. You can see just how small in terms of scope this weapon really is, hence why I believe it could be used in this alternate Second World War. Not so long after that, the French divisions would be forced to surrender, or risk being annihilated. They would be deep into enemy territory, and without any backup and nuclear weapons being used upon them, there would be no hope for the French divisions trapped in Breda. The Germans successfully trapped the French, and this would be a heavy morale boost for the Germans' fear, as for the first 1.5 years of the war they were suffering only losses. Additionally, this battle can be seen as a decisive one that would turn the tides of the war. Now for the Eastern Front. I already mentioned that Finland would drop out of the war, so you may assume that Russia would perform better, but I don't think this would be the case. This is all because of Hungary, who I would say are the soft underbelly of the axis of revenge. This is because only about 60% of the people in Hungary are ethnic Hungarians, so the remaining 40% will cause a lot of trouble. This is especially seen with the Slovaks and the Romanians. Due to geographical proximity, the Slovaks will be soon liberated by German and Polish troops, causing a great blow to the Hungarians. Russia is still nowhere close to help Hungary out, but the Italians would border them. The thing is that Italy is not too interested in helping the Hungarians out, as Italy is not a member of the Axis of Revenge, but they would cooperate with them. The Italians want to reach their own goal of subjugating the Balkans, and once that is done, they can leave the war, so they will focus on achieving this first. Hungary is practically encircled, as I don't see the Italians helping them out for the reason I just outlined. Italy and the Axis of Revenge don't like each other, as France is claiming Italian lands, which the Italians took after their victory in the Great War. This alliance between Italy and the Axis of Revenge is one of convenience, and because they share the same enemies. Also, the Axis of Revenge and Italy are ideologically different, but are working together for a shared goal, which is to topple German hegemony. This is like the United Kingdom and the United States of America working with the Soviet Union historically. They did that because of the greater enemy, which was Germany, and after the Germans were defeated, there was a cold war between the two sides. This is why Hungary will start losing land, and their advances in Transylvania would stall due to Romanian rebellions, but also because they lost almost all of Slovakia. Considering this situation, I think it's fair to say that Germany would soon recapture Vienna and enter Hungarian Burgenland, mainly inhabited by German speakers. Poland and Ukraine would also be very committed to their German allies, as in the case of victory, Poland would be promised all of Belarus and an opportunity to include Lithuania if it's desired by both parties. As for Ukraine, they would triple their territory in a case of a German victory, so this is serving as a morale boost for both of these countries. Ukraine and Poland were also invaded by the Russians, so the people are determined to fight, but there is also another perspective to consider, not just the territorial gains. Ukraine and Poland were part of the former Russian Empire, where they were oppressed and underdeveloped on purpose by the Russians. For the Ukrainians and Poles, the war is one of survival, not just one of expansion. There is a lot for them to gain, but also a lot to lose, so they would fight hard and be really committed to the war effort. This is why I would think that they would start pushing the Russians out of the Baltics, Poland and Ukraine, but Russia would still hold their ground around the city of Kiev. Seeing this weakness, the Turkish Sultanate, which is allied with Germany and Persia, would enter the war, with the goal to reclaim some of their lost territories. As to mention Persia, they would have an easy time to capture Russian Armenia, but pushing beyond the Caucasus Mountains would be practically impossible. Persia would focus on Central Asia, with the goal to liberate and integrate these Muslim people into their empire. In the region, there was a Muslim rebellion in 1921, so these people may just rise up again with the goal of securing their own state. As for the Balkans, Italy would have a big advantage, as I see them taking most of Macedonia, maybe even the city of Thessaloniki, also known as Salonika, where the Salonika Pact was signed. This would be a big blow for morale for all its members, but also it would cut Greece away from Bulgaria, isolating the two countries. Germany also has more important things to deal with, rather than to save the Balkans, so they would be left upon their own fate. Now, historically, in the Second World War, the Italians failed to take the Greeks on their own, but I believe the situation is quite different. Firstly, because historically, Italy had to fight only through Albania and go into fortified Greek positions. Now, this is not the case, as they would have Illyria, which is committed to unite the South Slavs under them. This opens up another front where Italy can expand their influence and conquer the Balkans. The situation is looking dire for my home country of Bulgaria. As for the Far East, Japan would take out Qingdao and the German Pacific easily, but they would have trouble taking Hong Kong and the British dominions in the region. Taiwan is in a position where they can aid Japan, opening a front for India and British Malaya, but this goes the other way around. In this timeline, I have decided that France would get to keep French Indochina, which is perhaps not too realistic. But this is how I decided to do it in the first episode, and I want to stick with that. Basically, the British can sway Taiwan on their side by promising them most of French Indochina in exchange for an alliance, which I think would be taken by Taiwan, with most of French Indochina soon falling. This would secure the British possessions in the Far East. Around the same time, the Americans are going to sign the Home Defense Act or the Lend-Lease Act, where they would officially help the British and the Germans, as they see Japan as a threat to their Philippine holdings, but they also see the Axis of Revenge as a threat to democracy. This is because although Germany is a monarchy, they are a constitutional one, with functional elections. Same can be said for the British, so the Americans can realistically support only one side, the one defending liberty. As I said, the front in the Balkans would look dire, as the Salonika Pact can be overrun if nothing is done. Germany cannot commit soldiers there, but they would have to keep them alive. This can lead to the Turkish Sultanate also falling. Most importantly, if the Salonika Pact doesn't capitulate to Italy, the Germans can use them to send troops over to Persia and Turkey, which are two separate fronts against the Russians. This means not having to fight on just one front. The Germans can see how the Russians cannot sustain fighting on three fronts, so they would try to alleviate pressure from the Salonika Pact. This can be done by cutting off Italy from Illyria. Realistically, Germany cannot fight in the Alps, but Istria is a flat terrain, where Germany can use their tanks and especially air advantage to successfully cut the Italians away from Illyria. Italy already controls the Adriatic Sea, so this wouldn't be a big blow for them, but now their supply has to travel through sea. This is a big problem, as I said earlier that Germany has a big air advantage over its enemies. This is because France never got around to producing a lot of airplanes, while Russia was barely keeping it together politically, and they had to suppress many rebellions. Hungary just became a free nation, so really Germany could overpower Italy alone in terms of air. Since the Italians are now having to use convoys for supplying their Balkan campaign, the Germans can drop their nuclear bombs on top of one, and if it connects successfully, it can destroy all the ships around it. Now I know that anti-air exists and such operations require absolute air superiority. I'm not saying that this would happen, but it's more likely than ever. Please remember that this is not realistic. Moving west to France, the country officially became an ultranationalist state in 1930, and just 2 years after that, they invaded the Germans out of fear that this was their only chance, as the Germans would soon outscale them in the future. The French people would obviously not be happy about the regime change, as the ultranationalists barely won over the communists. The French secret police tried to get rid of most communist sympathizers, but this just pushed them into hiding and antagonized them further. In 1934, while the war is still ongoing, Joseph Darnaud would be assassinated by a pro-communist group, whose goal is to end the war. This would happen as Joseph Darnaud would be giving a speech to his generals, and a bomb planted in a suitcase would go off in the room, killing him and injuring 20 people. This is a big blow to France politically, but it doesn't change the situation on the front lines, which as of right now is favorable for the French. This means that France is becoming more and more unstable, and they have to suppress their people further, which would use vital war resources and manpower. Cracks are starting to show in the dictatorial regime. The army commanders also do not sympathize with the ruling ideology, but are serving their beloved country. The problem is that the communists wanted to put Charles de Gaulle in charge, as they believed that he would either end the war or win it easily. I say this is a problem because the French ultranationalists would suspect that because he was put as the successor of Joseph Darnaud, that Charles de Gaulle must be involved in the killing of the French supreme leader. This is why not so long after that, Charles de Gaulle would be confronted and choose to die as a national hero, as he would claim his own life. France would lose the head of its ultranationalist revolution and perhaps their best army general, who was leading the super heavy tanks into battle and winning almost in all fronts. When news of this would reach the Germans, they would drop pamphlets onto the French people, where they would tell them the peace conditions. Germany will not take any French lands or seek war reparations. Even more, the Germans would help them install a functional democracy in France and get rid of the tyrannical dictatorship. Due to the lack of resources for the French, we can assume that under this ultranationalist France, that the Frenchmen would have a similar life to the historical German-occupied France, or at least Vichy France. Germany will also take advantage of the news and go into Belgium, with the hope to reach the pockets of Belgian resistance and to help them, liberating the country in the process. Considering the situation, I would say that exactly this would happen. The Germans would also find more effective ways to destroy the French super heavy tanks, not just with nuclear weapons, but with regular bombs that are dropped more accurately, due to better technology and pilot training. France is really screwed, and the German and the British will focus on destroying the French first, as this would perhaps make Italy drop out of the war, and then the German sphere can focus on taking down Russia, Hungary and Japan. Speaking of Hungary, considering that they have to fight a war on almost all fronts, but also to suppress the Slovaks, Romanians and the South Slavs, while also being semi-encircled, as Italy would not aid them too much, I would say that Hungary will sooner or later collapse. At that point, the Hungarians have been at war for almost 4 years, as they took part in the collapse of Austria-Hungary and Illyria, fighting against Austria and Illyria, and then with the Romanians and the Salonika Pact. And now they're fighting exactly the same enemies, excluding Illyria, but also the entirety of the German sphere. This is why I would say that it's inevitable for Hungary to collapse under these circumstances. This would alleviate a lot of pressure from the Salonika Pact, and with German aid in cutting the Italians from the peninsula, the Bulgarians can reclaim Macedonia and to link up with the Greeks. The French are going to be inevitably invaded from Belgium, which was just fully retaken by the Germans, who are ready to take revenge in France. There will be a major tank battle around the city of Amiens, but considering the German tank, air and nuclear advantage, as well as Charles de Gaulle not being alive to lead his troops, it would result in a decisive German victory, opening up the way to capture Paris. At that point, the communists would try to trigger a civil war in France and occupy much of the south, with Germany occupying the north. With France out of the war, the Italians would also sue for peace, as they would be next on the chopping block, without any clear chance of victory considering the situation. This would also bring peace upon the Balkans. Russia and Japan are the only countries left in the war, and they cannot turn the tides of the war on their own. But out of sheer insanity by their ruling high command, the war would drag on and take the lives of millions more people. We can expect that to fully pacify Russia and Japan, it can take 1 or 2 years of extra combat. But the war is practically won by the German sphere and the United Kingdom. The war would take the lives of around 50 million people, which is less than the Second World War in our timeline. But this is because I didn't account for Japan invading China in this scenario, which may be possible, but I neglected Asia on purpose, as I didn't know what could happen there. Anyways, let me show you the peace treaty in Europe. Germany would keep their promise to not punish the French, but would install a functioning monarchy. The communists in France, which enjoyed a lot of support, would merge with some democratic parties to form the Social Democratic Party of France, having the same ideology as Germany and Britain. The British would take most of the French colonies in Africa and the Pacific, with India seizing the French India territory. The Netherlands would annex the French Caribbean as compensation. Italy would lose Savoy and Nice to France, and their personal union with Illyria would be broken. Germany would take this time to fully integrate Austria-Bohemia into the empire, but also Burgenland from Hungary and South Tyrol from Italy, including the Istrian Peninsula, which used to be part of the Austrian Empire. Britain would take Malta, but also all of the Italian colonies. Bulgaria would occupy Illyria, with the goal to unite all the South Slavs, but considering the situation, it will be not too possible, even if Bulgaria adds a separate crown. The Balkans would see the need to stand united, so a Balkan Federation is possible, where the kings would continue to rule over their countries, but have a shared army and foreign policy, sort of like the German Empire and even the Holy Roman Empire, being sort of decentralized. This alliance would include Illyria, but Romania is unlikely to join for the time being, so all of the Balkans would be united under one. As for Romania, they would get their claimed territories of Hungary, which is Transylvania. Hungary would also lose Slovakia and the South Slavic lands, leaving them only with their core territory. Ukraine and Poland would also expand into their claimed territories at the expense of Russia, with Finland either gaining Karelia and the Kola Peninsula or there being created a separate Karelian nation. The Turkish Sultanate would also reclaim all of their lost lands, with Georgia and Armenia getting their full independence, Persia taking Dagestan and Chechnya, but also all of Turkmenistan, with the rest becoming known as the Central Asian Federation. As for the Japanese, Britain would take all of their islands and liberate Korea. Germany would focus on rebuilding France and Italy, preferring to have them as allies rather than enemies. Additionally, there can be a Cold War between the German sphere and the English-speaking sphere, which is the British Commonwealth and the United States of America, so this can be the unifying force needed to make peace in Europe. Around the same time, Germany would fully perfect their nuclear technology and in 1940 would have a successful test of an atomic bomb in Namibia that can wipe out an entire city. Use of this would spread around the world, and soon all of the major powers would have such a technology of their own. This would result in mutually assured destruction on all sides. I don't think that the borders in Europe would fluctuate too much, but there is also no decolonization, so the entire world is completely unrecognizable. I think that with the possession of the atomic bomb, Germany would keep their gains and hegemony over Europe, so we can expect that these borders would last us up until the modern day, unless the Balkan Federation collapses. Thank you for watching and I wish you the best day possible. Goodbye.